And welcome to the Jordan B. Peterson community. Every Saturday, we do the Jordan B. Peterson study group, where you can engage in discussions about Peterson's lectures or a related topic. Actually, if you're American, it'll be Friday nights as well as Saturday mornings. On the last week of every second month, we do the study group, which becomes a reading group instead, where we discuss one of Peterson's recommended texts. We also do fan recommendation for books. Next week, we'll be discussing how to read a book. And you can get all the details at jordanbpeterson.community. In this episode, or this week's discussions, we're going to talk about John Buck's What is Metaphorical Truth? He did a video essay recently, and he's one of our members for the past few years, so we thought we would showcase it and let John elaborate on it. So John, take it away.
Hey, so what do you think, coming up, we'll have to go through reading Jordanetics, won't we? Really see what Box Day and Owen Benjamin's critiques are of them. See if they pass the muster at all.
Yeah, maybe. I'm actually really interested in all that stuff.
Yeah, I listened to one review on it, though they were from fans of Peterson, so I don't know. I've listened to a few of Box Day's other stuff, but anyway, that's off topic, I guess.
It was actually like a documentary that featured him that I watched on YouTube. It was like shut
Box
him
Day?
down.
The Peterson. Yeah, that was a good documentary.
Balanced, yeah. I was just like, wow, they presented like all the sides of the argument. It's really good.
I thought it was really interesting. They were showing the trans kids' perspective, going through all that, and like how life kind of stayed pretty much the same while Peterson became this huge multimillionaire.
Yeah. But yeah, John, just give us the overview of what you discussed and what type of audience you're targeting. And
yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, so I guess kind of started this out wanting to get a better understanding of what the term that was being used by people like Brett Weinstein and a few others of metaphorical truth, because it seemed like there was kind of like different uses of kind of the same concept, though. And so the first part of the video is kind of going over the differing uses that have been done by people like Brett Weinstein, Jonathan Pageau, Jordan Peterson, and also I bring in Nassim Nicholas Taleb in it as well, even though he doesn't use any particular phrase like it. But one of his main concepts that he has called the green lumber fallacy, or the green lumber problem, is fitting because it's the green lumber problem is in relation to a story where this trader on Wall Street knew all the facts about what the types of green lumber that was out there, like the best types, where it was grown, what sizes it was, and all of the information, like how long it keeps, and all the different information on green lumber. But in regards to actually making a profit in selling, he was horrible at it. And then he found out there was somebody else that was there at the firm that was really good and actually sold a lot of, or not sold, but made good trades on green lumber. And it turns out that older gentleman that was really good at the trading thought that green lumber just meant wood that was painted green, and it didn't mean it was like freshly cut lumber. And so the fallacy that Taleb brings up is that in order to make decisions, it's not really necessary to know all the information about the facts. And in fact, a lot of the time, those facts kind of get in the way of understanding how to make good business decisions, or any decisions in general. And so what I like about Taleb is he brings in how a lot of the things that we interact with in our day-to-day life are completely kind of entrenched within uncertainty, like the stock market and a lot of things like that. And yeah, just having a better understanding of like how little we know in regards to predicting future outcomes. But anyway, okay, so there's kind of like 4 different definitions of metaphorical truth that have kind of been used around. With Brett Weinstein, it's things that it's like in opposition to what is scientifically known to be true. But if you were to believe it otherwise, you would be benefited evolutionarily than if you were to believe in only the scientific reality. So, like having a belief that after you die you'll go to heaven, you'll have a much better chance of setting your future generations up for survivability than if you had no such belief. That's kind of what the metaphorical truth is in relation to. But there's other instances as well. Like in one of the conversations, he brings up how we have this type of metaphorical truths that we act according to in regards to firearm safety, where you treat a gun as if it's loaded, but even though it's actually not, and you can you already know the factual reality about it, that it's not loaded, but you still treat it as if it is. And then for Jonathan Peugeot, metaphorical truth is kind of like relating. Okay, so for Peugeot, I realize this kind of ties into his icon carving, because an icon is something, for him, is something that kind of brings many different truths all together into one kind of place. So just around Christmas time, there's the idea of Christ in the manger with the 3 wise men and the shepherds and the donkey and the cow, and they're in the stable there. And a lot of those elements are part of the nativity story, but never all having actually happened at that same exact time in the literature itself. Whereas in relating that story, we put all of those things kind of together into this one picture in order to kind of tell the story about the entire nativity, things like that. And so for Peugeot, it's a metaphorical truth is like an encapsulation of all these things that are not like directly connected, but still being put together into something that is more real, which kind of fits with Peterson's usage of like fiction being true, where it's an abstraction out from the multitude of people, where you get a kind of meta character or an archetype of a type of person in a story, and then you can get a better understanding of like that archetype in other people that you interact with. But as for the audience, I specifically went out in trying to make this more, I guess, hospitable for the more atheistic types. And I actually tried to really bring in the best arguments against metaphorical truth that people like Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris has actually put to it, aside from the more, I guess, surface level reactions of like, that's actually lying, and or it's not true. It's obvious as it's not true, because a lot of times what's true is we're unaware of. And so that's something that Brett Weinstein brings up, is in those instances where we're unaware of a certain factual reality, a metaphorical truth is more useful than just being agnostic to whatever the reality actually is, because we might not know exactly what's causing this, but if we treat it in such a way and get a positive result, then we can assume whatever it was that was that caused us to avoid this certain thing is a good enough heuristic for dealing with this. Yeah, that's I guess. Oh, and yeah. So my audience I was trying to get was more towards the strict Sam Harris type crowd, in order to get them a little bit more open to this concept. And it's really a change in the way of conceiving truth away from a binary like property of an object or a proposition, something like that. And it's more of a scale where a proposition can be true in one instance, or it can be true in like 100 different instances. And so the proposition that's true in 100 instances is more true, and instead of both propositions or statements or ideas or values being true in kind of the same way. But I think as I was going through my notes for this, maybe I should let you guys talk. Just because I don't know. You said you watched like the first 20 minutes of it, Ben?
Yeah, so because we talked when you were wrestling through this issue a few weeks ago, I think it was our axioms discussion. And I think, myself and you, we got into a lengthy argument about the categorizations, because I thought that they were a bit inadequately applied, or not, what is it, too broadly applied, rather than specific enough. And then that's not the right terminology, but then I only had time to watch like the first 10 minutes, and I was like, oh, it's really for those who don't know, John did a video. It's What is Metaphorical Truth. It's on his own YouTube channel, and it's a 50-minute video where he goes over what is metaphorical truth. It's a video essay. It's really well done, really well edited. So he's got clips, like 1-minute clips, tying from different intellectuals through interviews and whatnot, then tying it in with a slideshow presentation that kind of connects all the dots. We've got the video in the description below, as well as the link to the slides there. And as always, all the links are in the description. But I was only able to watch like the first 10 or 20 minutes of it, in which case it was kind of recounting things we discussed previously, which is kind of unfortunate, because I imagine once we got past that, then we would have discussed the other bit. Because if I remember correctly, my contention with last time was that if a metaphorical truth then is determined to offer a better outcome, then it becomes a scientific truth, because there is a context in which believing that then makes it produces or predicts a certain outcome. In which case, then it's the science of probabilities instead. And
there's a much stricter definition for scientific truth than there is for metaphorical truth. So a scientific truth has to have a falsibility aspect to it. So and it does make predictions, but it's also something that cannot be proven false in any circumstance. So let's say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, or is it Celsius or Fahrenheit? And that's like a metaphor. That's a scientific proclamation. And yes, that's kind of the
on the planet Earth.
Yes, that's the added like context for which that scientific truth is always accurate, as long as it's at the regular atmosphere level at sea level.
In the year 2018.
Yes.
We hope.
So, but also just like different like mathematical truths are also scientific truths in a certain way, because even though they rely upon like axioms and assumptions, they are going to always be true. Like there's never an instance where 2 + 2 = 5. It's within the already assumed axioms and presuppositions. 2 + 2 is always going to equals 4. Now, okay, so you were saying that when a metaphorical truth enters like the predictability scale, like if a metaphorical truth gives predictive gives a predictive account that it proves functional, that's when it turns into a scientific truth?
Yeah, true, because then it's in the realm of making predictions, which is the realm of trying to understand what is true. Let me just pull up your slide deck here.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Because for what you said about the scientific truth about it being binary, well, so like statistics isn't binary at all, except statistics is one of the I guess in mathematics and in the scientific area. So like a thing called Bayesian networks, for instance, we learned this in computer science theory, where so in this case, you get the probabilities, right? Whereas, here there's a 40% chance of it being, the sprinklers will have a 40% chance of being on if it didn't rain. If it didn't rain, then it'll be a 60% chance that they weren't on. If it did rain, there'll be a 1% chance. If it did rain, there's a 99% chance then of the sprinklers not being on. So it gives you like the probabilities of the all the different outcomes. Because I see there's like a lot of crossover here with, like I say, a metaphorical truth, because then it could be like, well, we predict that if you believe that, it's better to believe the gun is always loaded, well, they have to come up with that moral-based judgment of it is better by having some type of probabilities associated with it, in which case they would represent that through like a Bayesian network tree. Like if you have this belief, what is the probabilities of it resulting in these actions? In which case then it does seem to become, in the realms of scientific, even though it's not in the empirically objective materialistic world. It's not a materialistic truth per se. It's more like an action truth or an abstraction. Yeah, an action truth, I guess.
Well, also, a metaphorical truth tends to always carry some sort of implicit value set within it, whereas any scientific truths, its values are like only insofar as it's a thing that you're observing. Like it's kind of value neutral for all its elements within the truth facts statement. And
all right, so let me put on my interlocutor hat here, John. Since it seems fairly obvious that metaphorical truth exists, that it's a thing, right? And it's also obvious that scientific fact is a thing. And there is this struggle between Harris and Peterson in the wider cultural dialogue between these two ideas. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there is such a struggle between this notion, since it seems so obvious that these things exist and they seem to be useful?
I think people don't like having other people tell them what they have to do. Okay, that's probably me being quite a bit too simple. There's a certainty that you get from scientific truth, and there's a comparability that you also get. You get a certainty and also a better understanding of the phenomenon itself through the scientific process than you would get through having only truths related to actions, where you can't even explore the phenomenon itself.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. I think it is something along those lines, and I think it's a tool, this argument between metaphorical and literal truth, scientific materialism and religious metaphorical truth. It's a tool being used by people who feel a certain way about things, right? It's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily contain the actualities of the argument at hand, right? Because I think that the reality is that both are equally useful, right? And it seems very true that
at different tasks, though.
Right, at different tasks, because without metaphorical truth, you cannot gain knowledge across domains, because that's precisely what metaphor is. It's finding out what stays true across separate concepts, right? That the process of holding one thing true across several knowledge domains and changing other aspects of it is a metaphorical process. And so it seems almost extraordinarily unwise to say that that's unnecessary, or somehow it would be better if we were to dispense with it, if we were to just glob entirely onto scientific fact.
I think there is a interesting objection that I'm still kind of wrestling with, that by using the word true, you're giving a kind of like false advertising to what we're talking about here, when we're actually referring to, say, like wisdom or metaphorical understanding or knowledge of things. And maybe those terms would be a better application. And I was considering this especially since at this point in time, the word true has a certain connotation to it, where it is that binary, to where you think, okay, this thing, like if we have the title of metaphorically true, and say, let's say the Christian story is metaphorically true, we're going to be thinking about it in regards to kind of the same way that we think of normal truths. Like, this is true, the Christian story is true, and all the other religious stories are false or not as true as this Christian story. But in regards to certain metaphorical truths, they both lead to the same outcome, or an equivalent outcome, and they both have the same like value sets nested within them, even though they are contradictory in certain ways. Like in one of the conversations, Brett Weinstein brings up how in Hinduism there's the metaphorical truth of reincarnation, and in Christianity it's the metaphorical truth of resurrection or heaven or afterlife, anything like that. And those are different ideas that still lead one to act in a good way in the life that they actually have. Either they're looking out, like they're keeping in mind the karma that's in store for them in their next life, or in the Christian story, the sins that they commit that will send them to hell, or if they make amends for those sins, be brought into heaven. So they're very different ideas that still have the same orienting value, or the same orienting process for the individual themselves in how they live out their lives. And so by having the term true, it might be placing the wrong idea of like what we're actually talking about in this situation, because there's equivalent systems of, or it's not necessarily equivalent, because there's going to be like differences in the fringes and different things like that, but they are still causing one to act in a certain way. Like, okay, so it might be the case that for a certain personality, they have, if they believe that this life is the only one they get, so they better be as nice and as kind as they can during this life as possible, then that would be the best truth for that personality specifically. Or it might be the case that if you're, say, somebody that has lived an improper life and realizes that you're a bad judge of your own ability to be right, and so you need to like give up to some higher power or community system or anything like that in order for your guiding morals, and then you like place yourself in accordance with those morals, and that's the best method for that personality. I don't know. That's at least and an interesting point against the term itself, metaphorical truth, and like maybe wisdom would be a more applicable, or it's like, because it's like a change in the model for understanding the world that you're living within. And so,
if we get away from the away from the abstract for just a second,
okay,
if we look at historically, etymologically, how we developed the use of the word true, what it originally meant, and even how it relates to how we use it now. But what it means to be true is to be reliable, right? To be faithful, to be loyal, so to speak, right? To be true is to accurately reproduce something over and over and over again, right?
Mm-hmm.
You true the sights of your rifle, or you be true to a particular speech. I mean, like, this means to reiterate precisely, right? Now, this is a very specific kind of action, usually preferred by the left hemisphere, let's say, right? A factual kind of reduction to a single iteration of something, right? The alternative to that is a kind of exploratory truth, right? Where you are moving in a space that is not fully mapped out, where you don't have a unique set of facts that describe all of the bits of knowledge or information associated with that area, right? This is the right hemisphere's exploratory tendency in the realm of chaos, right?
Yeah, because within the right hemisphere, things can have multiple levels of truth within them at the same time. Whereas when you're looking at things from a more leftist or a left focused hemisphere, you're thinking about you're like defining things down to their singular property, different things like that. So like the Sargen It quote about everyman has the line between good and evil drawn across their entire soul. That's kind of it's somebody is both good and evil within the same things, even though those are two polar opposites that are contradictory to one another, but they're still existing with it, or their capacity to be expressed still exists within every single individual.
Well, yeah, so if you listen to the speech, and this is I think where I was headed with my point. If you listen to the speech of people who are predominantly left hemispherically focused, like Sam Harris, people who prefer facts and reductionist arguments, they kind of say from time to time, listen, maybe this is true, but I feel like I would be betraying, right, what I know to be true. You hear this, I think, more frequently from what's that other guy's name?
Gad Saad, I know. Gad Saad is like allergic to anything that is untrue. Where and that's a lot of like people's objection to religion is like after they've looked into some of the certain aspects of it and having a more literalistic impression of the stories or different things like that, coming to the realization that there are there's more a fluid interpretation to the Bible as a non-literalistic reading. Anyway, it caused a lot of people to believe it to be untrue, and to believe that they've been lied to, which I think raises an interesting question as to whether if you're actually, I don't know. That's a side.
So I think what happens in this particular case you brought up is, whereas before they were relying upon other people to tell them the truth, like when they were young, eventually they find out that people were lying to them, and so their somewhat radical reaction is a complete withdrawal into total skepticism, right? So now they're wholly reliant upon themselves for determining all truth. This is an impossible task, in fact, but it does inflate the ego to such a degree that I think it forces this perspective on you. And this is why there's such a commonality amongst the militant atheist type, let's say. It kind of enforces this perspective that you have the sense, and I think this is just the left hemisphere speaking loudly, and you have the sense that you could just map out the whole world in facts if you just measure it carefully enough, right? That's the sense of it. Whereas the opposite sensation for many people in the right hemispherical landscape is the sense of, I don't know what the hell's going on, and it could be all these different things, right? And it's like this conversation is, it's a sequence of two different kinds of thinking altogether. Other authors and thinkers have divided it up like fast thinking and slow thinking. I think these are important parts of what it is to be a creature that can adapt across several knowledge domains, right? You have to be able to metaphorically carry factual information that you discover in the world epistemologically, like through trying to discover knowledge. You have to be able to make it useful, right?
And I was thinking, what like Ben had brought up earlier, I don't know if a metaphorical truth turns into a scientific truth. More so, it turns into kind of an underlying axiom for a culture, where it's something that cannot be proven, but it's something that we still like rely upon, even though it can't be proven, such as like with the axioms of mathematics or the axiom of causation itself. And I don't know, I think as well like an axiom of free will or something akin to free will that a lot of people like, I don't know, in order to have morality, you kind of have to have that capacity to make choices and something similar to free will in order to, because I don't know, ought implies can, and so if you have no other capacity then to do what you actually do, then there's no like ought that can be derived for I don't know, a person living their own life. Sorry. All right. Did you want to bring up?
Let's go through these definitions because it still seems fuzzy to me. So let's try and work through this. Okay, we've got a simplified conception of a phenomenon. That seems fine. That's just like a abstraction, I guess. A modern
you could say like a selfish gene is kind of a metaphorical truth in regards to like explaining the actions of organisms, and they're acting as if the gene itself was pulling the strings and causing the host to act in accordance to getting that gene propagated as much as possible.
Pretty much any, like it's also a matter of perspective, right? So then any anthropocentric or any anthropomorphism we do is kind of like a metaphorical truth. So for listeners, anthropomorphism is what we do with cartoon characters, or where we ascribe emotions or human characteristics to objects or fictional beings, kind of thing. So it could even be a chair. So like a lot of languages associate gender to inanimate objects, which is infuriating if you're actually trying to learn those languages. So, but then we also do it, like say Bambi. The reason we care about Bambi is because we can project our own feelings on, or our own reality onto Bambi.
And so that's a similar aspect to a metaphor or analogy in fiction or anything like that. So like we might read Aesop's fables, and it's a story about a bird and a fox. And so these are like things completely unrelated to us. But because we use those stories in order to relate to our own present lives, we're metaphorically realizing the connections between this fictional story and our own lives and our encounters that we'll have into the future, and we can get a better understanding for like how to act or like what type of characteristic we're expressing by having that basis.
Would this also be like when you get into like a axiomatic argument with someone, and then if they're not ready to actually engage, then they fall back onto that unifying truth? where they'll be like, people just need to learn how to get along. That'll solve all the world's problems, right? Like they project this, I guess, this metaphorical truth, which would be the simplified conception of a phenomenon being life, or whatever key problem that it is that they have. So they then project the simplified conception because they need something, because you're kind of thrown onto this world without the ability to get all the information to have a comprehensive scientific belief of what you're meant to do.
So yeah, when you're coming up against circumstances that are unfamiliar to you or novel, and so like you would be unsure of like how to act, you'll fall back upon the narrative that you rely upon in order to like try to just kind of like repeat your argument to the person that you encounter. So like one of the axioms of objectivism is that consciousness is for experiencing reality, or it's like consciousness is experiencing reality as it actually is. That's kind of the axiom that they use in order to kind of build their religion off of reason and secularity or secularity. I don't know. That's I don't know, just the one that came to mind. That the kind of central axiom or narrative to fall back on. Because I've talked to several objectivists about the different things like this, and objectivists don't like it when you bring up things like metaphorical truth or our incapacity to understand reality as it actually is. So
yeah, well, I think it's because what it seems to me is it's like the Dawkins versus the Christian Society. What is it? Who was the guy? He's an Australian.
Kim Ham?
I don't know. Yeah, Kim Ham.
Yeah.
Is it? Dawkins versus... It reminds me of that conversation.
There's a lot of those types of debates out there, yeah.
Yeah, whereas Kenham. So, because I think it's... Because just from an initial interpretation of this, it seems like metaphorical truth is being pushed by people who aren't scientists. It's being, and that's then causing them to not have it's not clear boundaries between metaphorical truth and scientific truth. Like they're not clear boundaries. So there seems to be a lot of overlap. So, for instance,
Okay. Interesting. Hold on. Wait. Okay. Wait. Interesting thought. Interesting thought. What if you considered emotions as metaphorical programs? Okay, so we know that there's electrical activity going on all the time, left and right hemisphere, and that it requires a specific kind of balance, and you need to utilize all the right kinds of regions and just the right timings. What if something like humility is the metaphorical program that your brain is supposed to run when the left hemisphere becomes too engrossed in its own model and thinks that it's always right? And it's actually the program that rebalances the total network effects from left hemisphere over to the right hemisphere in the realm of greater possibility and chaos. Right? Now, the reason why to think of it as a metaphor is something like this. And we'll go to Brett Weinstein's example of the quill throwing porcupine, okay? When you're the adult and you're talking to the child and you say, don't go near the porcupine, the child says what? Why? Right? All right, so now you have to come up with an excuse. You have to come up with a reason. And what do? You say, because it can hurt you, right? So I won't get too close. You're like, okay, all right. So now you have to find a way to get the child to obey, to listen, right? Without having to give them a gigantic explanation about how the quills are going to hurt, how they're going to stab you in the skin, yada, 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 right? So what you do is you compress into a hidden, it's like a hidden intention, right? Your intention is to save the child from pain and suffering, but you're compressing that hidden intention into the phrase, it can throw its quills, right? like your intention exists within your mind, and you are speaking the words to create that intention in reality.
Yeah.
That's what the communication is, right? So that's what the metaphor is. It's the production of a incentivized intention
For action, yes.
for
Whereas
action.
scientific
That
truth
may,
contains no action orientation within it,
Right.
from my understanding of scientific. Like, I don't, I don't know. It seems like through Hume's guillotine, I cannot see how a scientific truth could have prescriptive action with it, nested within it.
well, I mean, like if we get the Bayesian network example here, right? Like that'll tell you, like this is specifically talking about actions, but you know, it's not saying whether you should, but it's still up to you to decide whether you should act, right? Like it
Yeah,
could be like,
that's true.
okay, what's the probability?
Yeah, I bring that up in the video. The one like powerhouse aspect of science is that it can tell us the end results to certain actions that we have now or of our environment, different things like that. And through those end results, we can get a better we can read those through, we can run those end results through our value filters of like whether that end result is something positive that we want to work towards or something negative that we want to work and avoid. But the values themselves are not derivable, I believe, through the objective statements about things as they are.
Well, those values are certainly subjective, right? Because then they also become contextual, which is you're going to have your values, I'm going to have mine, an organization will have its, and a country will have its, right? So then, like, they could interpret this, and then they'll have different things. Like, if we add in a result thing here, grass dead, right? Where it then becomes an evolving like Bayesian network, where it actually, as time goes by, the probabilities change, and then an outcome becomes more likely or not, and then we have weightings associated to, you know, the good or the bad, right? Like, so that's still like this theory, like it's kind of a like these are statistical models, like that type of thing. So this actually touches on this next point, which is a motto that furthers an end goal when it's put into action. Now, say this is only like that furthers an end goal is then to say is to use like statistics, right? Or it's used something which is scientific to then say that it furthers. Whereas it seems if you then want to contain that within metaphorical rather than scientific, then it would be a motto that we assume furthers an end goal. But then even if it's assumed, like we're still going into the, so it's not scientific theory because, so like if we look into the scientific or science, then we get the scientific method, in which case someone proposes a hypothesis, which is then like a scientific theory that is testable. And then a scientific theory is then just like a more testable theory. So then this would be a theory right now, a motto that furthers an end goal when it's put into action. And then we can either test it and then evaluate whether or not it is empirically true, or whether or not it's just a assumption that people act. So I think here it becomes more valuable. Same with a heuristic that is true more often than is not. That's a scientific statement, I guess. Whereas, but if we to then give the opposite, you know, diligence, then like like Santa Claus, for instance, that's something that is not literally true, not objectively true. It's something that, you know, is a fib that is told to produce an outcome. But when I say that it's a fib that we're told to produce an outcome, that's then an assumption of me over its probability to produce the desirable outcome. It may not actually produce the outcome I want at all, or it may, like, there may be zero correlation. It's just like this faith-based assumption.
Yeah,
like
If,
it's a that I haven't proved.
what is statistical truth like this? So it's
he's talking about Bayesian. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. But let me ask you this: so, if tomorrow the sun did not rise, and the day after that it just continued rising, what conclusion could you draw from that statistically?
Well, well, that all depends on, the model that you're going to use, right? Because then you would just come up with a model and be like, from the day where the sun went away, there's a 100% chance that that the sun isn't rising. Like, statistics is only used, I guess, in the relation to whatever it is that they're trying to observe. Which is still, like, that's when this Hume-Or thing comes, because you still have to decide what are you going to observe, uh, or how are you going to construct this model, that you're actually going to test. Like, how do you turn the theory, which is just an assumption about how things behave, into a scientific theory, which is something that is testable, that then requires you to develop a model, develop the context which you will test and whatnot.
Yeah, go further with your point that you were trying to make, Tyler, because I'm not sure I understand what you were getting at with that.
What measurements will you accept as valid and true? So, for instance, there are lots and lots of historical accounts of the sun not rising. Some fairly large ones, right, in some of the major religions. That is an eyewitness and measurement, let's say, right? But nobody accepts that now, right? No modern person accepts this. Well, maybe lots of people do, actually, but these are the people that Sam Harris makes fun of, right?
Yeah.
So, like, what is it that you accept? Well, so if you probe in on that, what it ends up being is, well, I accept the scientific consensus, right? Because no one's ever measured the distance to the sun. You haven't walked out each of the 93 million miles between here and there, right? And because of that, there's an extraordinarily large array of facts that are completely taken on faith, right? And it's all based on the notion that there is a great body of people that are all agreeing together, that they're all measuring the same thing, and that it all kind of works and makes sense. A lot of that's based on the fact that all of our technology that's also based on science is so wonderfully functional and reliable, right? But who of us has actually spent any amount of time checking all of the facts that are presented to us? Like, not even close, right?
Well, I don't know. It seems like you're kind of straw matting, and because then it's kind of treating science as a religion rather than as a framework for finding truth, which is
well, it's sort of like a religion in where discovering truth is the primary objective. Now, there are certain qualifications for what type of truth they're willing to accept also. So, like, metaphorical truth could not, a certain, like, metaphorical heuristic for survival is not a acceptable truth within the field of the religion of science. So
if you limit science to being only the realm of the people who are dealing with literal factual truth, then literally no one belongs to the realm of science, because science is always wrong and continually being revised. If you think of it that way, right? It's always being updated. It's always being revised.
Well, wrong is always wrong is a bit like it's our best working estimates of what produces the best, like what model has produced the highest reliability that we can depend on,
right? And you can think of those as like metaphors.
We can come up with better ways of finding things out, or better models. Yeah,
right. So those are metaphorical models of the world, right? And so every single scientific model is a more or less accurate metaphorical model of the world, accurate to the factual description of this world, right? Sans any motivation for things, but
yeah. So, like, you can see...
let me pose it another way then. So when you look at all the people practicing science today, all right, and this is the great argument being taken place in climate science, for instance. You have a group of people who have one theory, and you have a group of people who have other theories and another group who have other theories, and they're all kind of working together to prove each of their individual theories. Who amongst them are working on science, right? Because some of them are clearly working on metaphors that are wrong, and some of them are working on metaphors that are right.
Well, I think it's even more interesting. Like Sean Carroll is kind of frustrated with the physics community because there are like 6 different explanations for quantum mechanics that are out there, and there's no scientific consensus on which of those is correct or factually true or anything like that. There's like multiple competing models that all explain the same phenomenon, the same facts, like the same observable realities about quantum mechanics. They're just relying upon different ideas or metaphors for what the reasoning behind the phenomenon that we experience, like
so
why
then
it is that these things happen.
Try and tie this in with maybe what seems to be the overarching theme here, which is if we go back before we developed the scientific method, then truth and religion were fairly much synonymous, like because your worldview was kind of embedded in your religion, and your religion made objective claims about the world that one believed. But then you had, based on people's different experiences or observed realities, they then associated different religions as being more true than not, and therefore they would fall into those different camps. Whereas now, through the scientific method, but then it's very similar then to what the physicists are doing, which is they don't have currently a way to prove their theory and disprove others, therefore making there needs to be some type of faith based on their perceptions of what matches their observed reality of this physics domain better. And it seems like the progression that has resulted from arguing one's entire worldview versus just the domain of physics or quantum mechanics, quantum physics, is that the development of the scientific method allowed the development of testing which truths are actually true, or sorry, I should say which assumptions. So it distinguished them between a truth and an assumption. And then it said, well, we need to test our assumptions to find out whether or not it does result in something that is true or false. Because if it is still false, and it's predictably false, then it is still a scientific truth. Like, it's true that this thing produces this outcome. And then through that, we've limited the domain of what we then consider, these faith-based realms that still are topsy-turvy about what we believe. So now the realms of where we require assumptive thinking would then be quantum mechanics would be one, or then things like maybe political global theory, like global politics would probably be one, because measuring global politics is very hard.
It's worse than that, because you can't take even anything more concretely confirmed and build some kind of moral structure and system of oughts out of it. You just can't do it, right? I mean, there's still this weird fundamental divide. So it's not just like that science is pushing back this envelope and truth kind of lies just beyond it, and one day we'll scrape it all away and find it all, and science will neatly assemble all the facts. There are truths that cannot be stated as a series of facts that can't be measured. There are truths that cannot be measured in the way that you would want to measure them in science. In other words, there are subjective truths and trans-subjective truths that cannot be measured and assembled and discussed and verified and falsified using the system of scientific method.
But how are we using truth for that? Like, what do you actually mean for this?
This is the argument, right? So Sam Harris is on the side of saying, like, well, there's kind of like a correspondence theory of truth, where there's an objective world and it is a series of facts, and you can assemble all those facts, and that is the best depiction of reality, is that it's a list of all those facts, right? And I think he misses the point, the extraordinarily important point that's actually, in fact, derived in logic of all places, and seen elsewhere across all knowledge domains, that there are some truths you cannot derive from within your system.
Yeah, what's an example?
Well, in logic, it was through Gödel's work. But an example would be something like
Heat equals A.
Well, no. What is Bin's most desirable future for himself? What scientific process will you bring to bear on that? Right? Like,
no. Well, that still seems to be something that eventually could be understood. Okay, there's two hypotheses there, or like two theories, which is, one is that science will be able to model everything, and then two is that science won't be able to model everything. That then there's going to be this realm for these for these, I don't know, some things will only be left to be assumptions, I guess. In which case, well, fine, because it also depends on how far does the what is it, the wishing well, is that the phrase, like how far the wishing well goes, or the because it could be like, the universe is like this never-ending looking glass.
Well, I think
it's always more things to find out.
It's the problem with reduction. It's a problem with reduction, because what seems to be going on in our heads is we're imagining the world reduced through the use of microscopes and electron tunneling and particle accelerators and whatever. We're imagining it being reduced down to a set of facts, right? And then from those facts, you're able to extrapolate the whole universe, right? That somehow, if you're able to assemble through the technology of mankind all of the health facts, that you would make perfect.
Well, it's not to say that our model of reality is reality. It's to say that our model of reality conceptualizes reality functional enough to be complete.
No, this is what I mean. Let me get this point out, because it's dramatically important, right? So when you do all your measurements, which is akin to the reductionist aspect of assigning the facts, right? This is how you do it. You make measurements and then compare those measurements and do them over and over again. If you get agreement, then they're facts, right? You make all those measurements and then you start assembling them, right? Because this is the opposite of reduction. If you want to predict the weather, for instance, you take the reduced mathematics that you've tried to model the world with, and then assemble a future, right? You make a prediction. This opposite process of assembling something together to predict the future is fundamentally chaotic and not predictable, and therefore produces a set of facts which are akin to this space that cannot be used to be as like a measuring ground where you can just assemble even more facts and build more structure from it, right? There is something extra beyond that assemblage of facts that occurs in the process of creating new structure that is fundamentally chaotic.
I think I touched on this partially in the video in describing how a model is being formed, and that by having the facts themselves, the observable realities out there, it does, even through complete analyzation of all the facts of reality, it would not give you a sufficient capacity to create a model for that reality.
That slide is missing. Is it? Where'd it go?
I think it was.
The best example is the grid, right? Probably the grid.
Yeah, the grid, or the ones two before it, I think, is when I actually said it. But yeah, it says it right there. Oh no, where is it? I don't know, somewhere in there. But okay, so go over that again. The facts themselves that are observed give no system, give no method of creating a model, and that a model for reality is a component of imagination and the metaphorically relating things to one another, which is not, and I think that's what you were kind of bringing up, Tyler, how the act of science itself has these things that are not derivable from science that are still like necessary in the production of science.
Right. There's something beyond the scientific method that's necessary for the discovery, the creation, and the refinement of our models of knowledge and the universe, right? Like it's not just reduction, it's construction, it's holism, it's a seeing the big picture too. And these are at the heart of the difference between scientific fact, reduced, condensed to some kind of essence, and then all of the compressed informational layers you can build up from those things, right? And when you start doing that, you get into a crazy realm.
So just so I understand what your argument here is, that because it seems what you're saying is the assumption that there will always be a dragon to blow out our models. Like that's which is like this call for chaos, right? Which is for the weather, for instance, we can have all these models, but then how far in the future can we predict the weather? Like, can we predict it 10,000 years in the future, or 1,000 years, or tomorrow? But then some things we can predict quite accurately 10,000 years, like, and especially with star, you know, the like.
No, you can't say that, man.
Okay, why?
We haven't made predictions for 10,000 years.
Okay, well, what's a repeatable phenomenon? Okay, like the creation of a helium atom or something like that. If a certain process occurs now, that same process occurring 10,000 years into the future will still create that helium atom.
Right,
yeah, like carbon dating, I guess, is
that's what we hope. Yeah. Right? It's such a fundamental assumption. Like, that's what we hope. But there are other elements. So, I mean, everyone would agree that the speed of light is constant, right? Clearly, right? All physicists. But then there are other scientists who question that. Maybe the speed of light changes with the size and shape of the universe, right? This is another competing theory that could be testable. That could be something that modifies our current conception, that overcomes Einsteinian general relativity and special relativity. Like this stuff happens all the time. So
yeah. But
there's
I'm
a
not
mindset.
Sure what this, but you're saying that, like, okay, that because the theories will always be revised and improved upon, there won't be an endpoint where we understand everything. Is that the argument?
Yeah. Because what you're saying is that once we have measured everything, then we will understand everything. And I'm saying that is almost certainly not the case.
I think an even simpler argument is just returning to Hume's guillotine, where anything that is stated as a scientific fact cannot be prescriptive unless values are somehow objective within, well, I don't know.
Well, like carbon dating is like an example where it is, oh, do you mean prescriptive as in moral?
Prescriptive as an ethic.
Okay,
yeah,
different than predictive.
Or
right.
not even just in ethics, but even in creating new models for reality, or like telling you where to look in order to fix your model.
As long as there are subjective individuals, this cannot be the case, right? So two people are sitting around a fire. One of them's 2 feet away, one of them's 5 feet away. The statement, the fire is too hot, right? Who is that true for? It is different based on the subjective location of the individual, right? And if you have different perspectives, that is the nature of the subjective, you are going to have disagreement about facts.
But then you're saying that, like, if you're going to say subjective truth isn't scientific, then you rule out psychology and psychiatry from science.
Well, that's the observation of reality. It's not prescriptive. Well, let's see.
Yeah, observation is another component of the measure. It's part of the measurement process, right? I don't want either of these two to be destroyed. I think they work both hand in hand. I think they're both built into us in our brains, right? What I see, and I guess my major point, is that in the wider conversation, in this discussion, and specifically why John made this very slideshow and presentation and video, is because there is a battle between these two types of truth. And it seems like it separates into two camps that fight each other, when in reality, it is two camps that need each other, right? It's two hemispheres that need each other. It's two views of the world that need each other.
Yeah. Although it depends, right? Because, like, 'cause I think there's two issues that, or like, because I'm trying to get inside your head here, Tyler, because there's some things which you're saying which I can understand and appreciate, and then there's other things which just seem to be faith-based needs to believe, right? Like where it's the idea that, because I think there's also seems to be then the assumption. Oh my gosh, something just fell down here. Hold up, 1 minute. Alrighty.
Poltergeist.
So the is that the need for humans to be under to be outside of definition or predictability.
No, it's not even that. It's the human need to act. Like action is a necessity to existence. And if the scientific worldview, Brett Weinstein considers it worldview 1001, which is like in reference to methodological naturalism, the worldview we presuppose in order to observe reality. Since there is a necessity within human existence for action, by having a worldview in which no prescribable actions can be derived from, this proves the insufficiency of the worldview itself.
Okay. So I think so. Any individual won't be sufficient to understand everything. So therefore, they do need to make faith-based assumptions about how to exist. However, that doesn't negate the body of knowledge which is external of humans. You would then say scientific knowledge or just knowledge in general. They pretty much mean the same thing in this instance, where it's just like that the scientific knowledge or knowledge is abstract from humans. And like we see this or external from humans. So for instance, you could, like a politician makes decisions or a psychologist makes decisions about you to affect your outcomes without you understanding the reasons why. And that happens a lot in the case where we're influenced by models that know us better than we know ourselves. And that's part of a successful governance. But
not necessarily. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So not necessarily is true there, but the point here is, okay, so humans, I guess, need metaphorical truth because we can't measure everything, right? If we're going to go with that, but then that's different than this unit of body of knowledge continuously refining, where it could understand humans to the extent where we do become entirely predictable. Now that, I guess, is assumptive on my behalf, but it seems, just to posit that out there, because you either have two posits there, so I grant that humans are insufficient to
But why do you
everything.
want them to be predictable? Let me ask you that.
I don't want them to be predictable, or I don't want, like, I don't want them. I'm apathetic to that.
Science wants everything to be predictable. We just discussed this, right? Science wants everything to be predictable. That's precisely what it wants.
Yeah.
So why do we want humans to be predictable?
Or why does the furthering of science want that?
Yeah. Well, it's a dominant theme, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well,
Why
I
is
don't
that?
think, like, some humans may want it for power control, whatever, but that's separate. Like, there isn't, like, this pursuit of knowledge, I guess, is driven by human interest, but the knowledge itself is apathetic.
Well, I don't
But
want to paint it as though it's some evil intention either. It could
yeah,
be something as simple as when your dog dies when you're a kid, you want to be able to make it live forever, right? And if you're growing up in the year 2230 and cryogenics is a thing, that's all the motivation you need,
yeah. Well, we
right?
get
That's
into
it.
this. Yeah, well, it's like a lot of extreme, I would say, high openness people tend to sometimes have a fear of death, which then drives them to the scientific pursuit. And I think that, again, this is the role of the Peterson hero, which is that it is someone who, like, and the way I've been able to conceptualize it from Maps of Meaning very well is that um, nature will kill you if you don't protect your future self from your inadequacies of your past, right? So you need to, as your present self, go out there to tame and employ your will onto nature, otherwise it will hurt you. And so to that extent, we need like that type of neuroticism, or that desire to protect ourselves, which isn't just for protection. Like, you know, beer, for instance, enjoying a nice cold one isn't protection, but it's something where we've employed our will to reap the benefits, like the pleasure, like aiming towards pleasure and avoiding pain. But it's this. But to be able to do those things, we need better predictive models. We need to actually acquire knowledge. So it's like the left hemisphere is the imploring of order onto the world, whereas the right
Exactly.
hemisphere is the idea of trying to understand it. But that human intention is very different from the models that we actually develop. So, for instance, like when we're driving a Tesla, which has automated driving, we don't need to know anything about the science of the automated driving. It can act on our behalf for us. And
It's true
I
for our
think,
bodies,
yeah,
right?
I guess. So, but so I think, you know, the type of idea that's showcased in like the Black Mirror dating episode, where the two couples give Google, or not Google, I should say, all their information. So then not Google can then make a predictive analysis of who the right partner is for them. I think those things are entirely within possibility. Now, I was actually thinking about this more recently, where I watched a pause and select series of videos on, what is it? Japanese people who develop, or they're not necessarily Japanese, but people who develop relationships with fictional characters. And they tend to fall into one of two categories. So one is someone who is doing it as an imitation for the real thing, and then they could become dangerous. Whereas there's others which completely acknowledge that it's a fictional character and do not view it as an imitation. They view it as this new type of relationship. And you see this with the movie Her, with Yoko and Phoenix in it, where it's just like these type. And I was thinking about this, where it's just like we see them as sex workers for disabled people. Not to say that that's fictional, that wasn't the point there, but that we can create these models to then fulfill like these new type of relationships to fulfill human desires better than what they could otherwise be. So you could think of a mentally handicapped person. So like say autism is a great example, high suicide rates, high loneliness, low success rates in marriage. So for that, then you could say perhaps a artificial relationship, like an AI relationship with them, the her type one, would actually produce far better outcomes for them. But then you have the idea of who chooses the outcomes, and it's just like, well, you have the scientific knowledge of the predictions about, you know, these things which you say these outcomes, la da da da, but then the person can opt into that, you know, based on their intuitions. Like they have the free will to utilize that separate external body of knowledge to then assist them, because that external body of knowledge could understand them better than what they can understand themselves.
Yeah.
I think I want
There's
to.
a lot there. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go.
The values that people can hold are variable.
I just,
So,
if you want to reply now, or because Blackleaf, we've got someone in the comments sending a bunch of comments. So should we read out their comments now, or do you want to just do your response?
Yeah, I didn't see the new ones that they put in. All right, so here's the idea I've been playing with. The idea of the Platonic God. Considered the set of all chairs and define them all as imperfect manifestation of the Platonic chair. The Platonic chair is perfect for all time, all purposes, all situations. Now consider all couches. Create the Platonic couch. Now, you can merge the Platonic couch and the Platonic chair into the level above that, the Platonic thing for sitting. Okay, now you're bringing in a Platonic functional, like you're bringing in the function of the thing as opposed to the objective status of the thing. Okay, and if you keep doing this, merging and merging and merging, you will eventually, at some level, merge all Platonic ideas and meta-Platonic ideas, etc., into the singular Platonic thing, which everything, including other Platonic ideals, are imperfect manifestations of. And so we will have created the Platonic God, perfect for all time, all people, all situations. Now, where I am stuck at the moment is where to go from there. And this is kind of something I wanted to bring up to Ben. Having a full-on description of the entire world, even having all of that and the predictions for like what people are going to act out, having the entirety of all knowledge that could be and is, still would not give you a prescriptive action for like what you should do that I can conceive of. It might say like, if you want.
How are you defining? Sorry, yeah, go on, because you're probably going to answer this right now. How are you defining prescriptive there?
Okay, so in the okay, let's see. Yeah, okay, having the. Well, okay. Well,
involuntarily committing someone to a mental institution because it's for their benefit.
But there's no difference between, like, okay, if that model matched them well, then that will produce a desirable outcome. If it matched them bad, a horrible outcome. But when it is
okay, so I guess here's a good question. Like
if they say that was really good for me, then it's a good outcome. If they say that was terrible, blah, 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 well, maybe who could trust a subjective opinion? But we do this with relationships. Like if we're in a marriage, we've now reduced our consent to leave to some extent because we're willing to engage in someone's involuntary, what would you call it, interactions with us because we have the faith that it's going to work out better.
Yeah, no, the point, though, is that when facts collide, who decides?
Well, it's not facts. It's when values collide. Who decides?
No. These become statements of fact. So when doctor says you are crazy and you say, no, I'm not, these are statements of fact, right? Like, and some level or another this is what's taking place at all scientific discussions, right? People are arguing over facts.
Okay, so that's...
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Can a error in, let's say, psychology be derivable from the practice of science? Because by assuming that someone is crazy, you're assuming some sort of Platonic idea for or ideal for what a mentally healthy person looks like. And you see that this person is not cohering to this Platonic ideal.
The average man, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. But even... Okay, so maybe that's how you can kind of derive a Platonic ideal in order to compare things against in measurement, is by taking the average of all humans that exist and then comparing against that, potentially.
So
That's one way you could do it. Or another way you could do it is like taking the longest living man and then compare the person against that to see like how close they relate to that person. Like there's many different ways in which you can measure and get completely differing results. And
so
yeah,
to tie what you've just said, what Tyler said, and what Blackleaf is saying. So the situation Tyler raised, where the doctor says you're crazy, and the person says no, I'm not, right? Well, how do you then measure which one is true? Because there's a difference. They're not both true. That's when they're in the stage of assumptive. Or so let's just posit this. Wait, so let me just posit this. Something is true when it is interoperable with the largest set of other truths. I guess, okay,
I can see
with
that.
this idea. Yeah, let me just run with this idea. So which is then Blackleaf's Platonic, right? So the more interruptible a model, like a predictive framework, a truth is, with other truths, then the more interruptible or the more Platonic it is. So you could have something that is true in this specific domain, but then it violates all these other truths. Right now, where it violates, then it doesn't meet then the criteria of a scientific, or it doesn't, I guess, then meet the criteria of wisdom, perhaps, maybe, or like, because then it has no Platonic value. It's just unique in that domain. And to some extent, that's the way that, I guess physics has gone, where it's been this truth is specific in this domain, even though it violates all these others, but it's still useful for us in this domain. So I guess the idea here is whether or not we can make, a Platonic truth, this one that is interruptible with the largest subset, whether we can get a point where we eliminate all black boxes of truth, all uninterruptible.
Yeah. Like Laplace's demon that knows all facts about reality. I'd say even with that.
All right. So there are two ways to construct knowledge, right? This is key, right? So there is the reduction to knowledge, and there is the construction to knowledge. And when we're talking about Platonic ideals, let's go with the doggy, right? This is famously treated by Plato and all, right? So that how many dogs you've seen throughout your life give you an average over those, say, 20 dogs you've seen about what a dog is. You have a memory of 20 different dogs. Let's say you remember each and every one of them. And someone has told you, using words, each one of them is a dog, right? And so you take the commonalities, the ones that you're capable of seeing, whatever those are, 4 legs, 2 ears, whatever, right? You take the commonalities across those and say, aha, this is how I define a dog, right? Now, that act of finding the commonalities is reduction. That is stripping away the parts that you deem are not relevant to this commonality issue, and then finding what is the essence of something. Now, the other end of that, though, is you've seen all these dogs, let's say they're mid-range dogs, right? And then one day you meet a Chihuahua. And you look at it and you're like, wait a minute, that's a rat. That's not a dog, right? But somebody says, no, that's a dog. What you immediately have to do is construct a new element, let's say, a new modification to this set of truths. And that is a different process than the one that allows you to extract an essence, right? You add to this body of knowledge and then manipulate further and iterate further on what you conceive of as the essence of this category of things, right? The process of being able to do that is tied up in the mysteriousness of consciousness, the ability to abstract anything at any given moment. That meta process, it's mystery, right?
John, do you want to dance with that?
Well, yeah. I guess just one thing to add to that is, with essentialism, the ever-shifting nature of evolution and mutations, and how the models that we have will influence our behavior and influence like how we adapt our environment, which our environment will then work to adapt us over time. So the thing that we were previous to interacting with our environment will actually adapt as well, to the point that what was true at one instance in time, or what was a operable metaphorical truth, like or metaphorical model for, let's say, humans or dogs or something like that, could require updating as our usage of that model comes up to like brick walls, or shows itself as being unable to predict certain outcomes or different things like that, or there's certain anomalies that arise out of this insufficient model that we then need to work into the model somehow.
Right. It's the presence of adaptability, right? That we need to be able to adapt to changing environments. And we do that through the process of metaphorical truth and the testing of facts.
Yeah. Can we go to slide 21? Or I don't know if you want to do it, Ben, or I can.
Yeah, I'll do it. All right. Let me just share that. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, this is another point. Good.
Yeah, this is kind of bringing in axioms from our talk a few weeks ago. How each of those like lines I see as kind of like girders that support a worldview that we have. And so let's say worldview number one is the scientific worldview of reality. And so there are, like, let's say that yellow line there is causation. That's an implicit axiom that cannot be derived out of the worldview itself, that is still utilized in order to function as a worldview. Let's say the red line there is materialism or methodological naturalism. And then, like, the green line is down at the lower end is what's another implicit axiom of science? A equals A. I don't know. Just there are these
logical proofs.
Yeah. Different things like that are non-derivable from the worldview itself, but are necessary in order to create that worldview. And these are the axioms that are used to create the models. Yes. Okay. So every model so we observe reality, and then we imagine and try to create models that fit within these axioms. So no model for reality can break any of these specific axioms. And I think the red line there, methodological naturalism, is a implicit assumption that is insufficient for worldview number two. Let's say worldview number two is human interactions with each other, or just ethical affairs, anything like that. To the point where I don't know if it's necessarily an axiom that cannot be supported within worldview number two, but it is not a necessary axiom for worldview number two. But this image itself is kind of in regards to all attempts at speaking to somebody with a different ideology of yourself. So if worldview number one is actually, let's say, objectivism, and worldview number two is I don't know, let's say Sam Harris's worldview or something like that. And the red line there is free will, man's free will to make choices from his own intention and consciousness. And then in worldview number two, that is a missing implicit assumption that makes it so that the facts, such as moral facts, things like that, like a person is responsible for the actions that they commit. Let's say that's the little speech bubble there. That statement carries a whole ton of like baggage behind it, of implicit values and assumptions about reality. And so when the objectivist is trying to talk to Sam Harris here, this is a factually incorrect statement because it does not cohere with worldview number 2.
Yeah, let me go back to the dogs, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
This is also very heady and abstract. So I don't know if I have a simple mind or if I just prefer to see it this way, but if you have your collection of 20 dogs you've seen throughout your life, and then someone brings the Chihuahua to you and says, this is a dog, and you say, no, this is not a dog, right? Let's broaden the example just a tad so we can bring in implicit assumptions, right? So let's say that the person who has seen the 20 dogs in their lifetime is a judge at a dog show, right? And the person with the Chihuahua in their arms coming to the judge wants to enter into the dog show. So behind each of these statements, this is a dog, no, it isn't, is this whole nest of implicit motivations and assumptions, right? Which includes something more like, I want to participate in this dog show, therefore I want this to be a dog, right?
Or it could even be like person number 1 has a description of dog in regards to their functionality. Like a dog is someone that I can hunt with, or something like that. Like I can use in helping me to hunt, and that's like built into their description of what a dog is based upon what they're capable of.
Right.
And so when a Chihuahua does not fit within that description, or because does not carry that functionality behind it.
If we go to this visual then, right, so each of these lines, these implicit assumptions. So if we take the dog example, so the green line could be has 4 legs. The red line could be hunts. The third line could be eats meat, right? So then like the one on the worldview 2 about what a dog is if you're a vegan environmentalist, right? Then it would be, well, the dog doesn't eat meat and the dog doesn't hunt. So they implicit assumptions there, right? And then you have it, but to make it more politically charged, this is the exact same situation that is happening with allowing men who believe that they're women in female sports, which is to what are these implicit assumptions that we have about what is female or what is woman or what is female sports or what is woman sports. Is it woman sports or is it female sports, right? And then why do we even have female sports or woman sports, right? Why do we have this? And one could be because it allows females to compete without male dominance, because that is actually an act of compassion and fairness. In which case then allowing a male into that, right? So then it's like this process of making what, like Peterson's got that great slide, right, where a implicit assumption is then challenged, right, where something is then violated, right? So it could be a male entering into a female sport believing that it's a woman's competition, not a female competition. And then that now changes or triggers the implicit assumptions or these axioms, I guess, of the audience to then have this discussion now, which is hopefully a scientific discussion about, well, which of these implicit assumptions are actually true. And then we come to, developing a model that is hopefully Platonic that allows us to operate.
Yeah, well, Blackleaf said something in chat, which is interesting. I think needs to be...
Yeah, I was going to get to that, but I wanted to bring up, I'm not necessarily sure if axiom and like implicit values are completely like mappable onto each other exactly. There's an aspect to values that is like what is used for measuring phenomenon. And I'm not sure if that's exactly the same thing. So, but I don't know. They're similar in that they're both kind of like implicit and non-derivable from the worldview itself. But yeah, do you want to read it, Tyler?
Non-derivable. That's a good segue into it. And well, I'm just looking at this one statement. All perfectly known futures are indistinguishable from the past. And this is a statement that's based on the notion that memory, in other words, our understanding of what happened in the past is a kind of perfect conception of what occurred, right? I think that's where he's making that phrase from. And that's partially true, right? So to the extent that you measure, you are measuring the past, right? You're measuring whatever occurred and then assembling that history and trying to make sense of it. And whatever that behavior is, it's fundamentally different from constructing something new, right? Which is what behavior is.
Let me read out what he's saying.
No, I want to.
John.
I'll go ahead. Yeah. All right. Which perhaps is Peterson's idea of truth, and why we can probably at best only not lie. Okay, because truth itself is something we are always unable to get at. It's like part of the infinite. It's God, or it's outside of human capacity to articulate fully in its fullness, because truth all leads back to the Platonic truth that's outside of itself. Peterson's view of truth seems to be the Platonic truth, true for me and my family and my community. So I was thinking about this in regards to like what we were describing in regards to function. So a Petersonian truth is something which works across a society. And it's kind of different from the scientific conception of truth, where factual relaying of what observable facts, things like that. And I brought this up in the video that there is
but when you say it like that, though, what you're doing is you're packaging scientific truth within metaphorical truth, where metaphorical truth is scientific truth plus interpretive, or plus value plus action, right? Because then it's a predictive model plus action plus value.
And you're stating that there's an assumption that facts exist outside of man's creation of them. Kind of a Platonic knower of all facts, in which we can, through the act of science, come to reach those facts as they exist in themselves.
Yeah, like I don't view mathematics as a subjective thing at all. I view it completely external to the human experience.
Sure. So how did I define it? Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'm speaking about truth in regards to what actually can be held. So like at one point in time, through the scientific method, our best model for reality was the Earth is flat. And that was scientifically true at that point in time. That's how I'm referring to truth in this instance, like what we know about reality.
Yeah, the consensus or the best model we have. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. And Peterson bringing in how it needs to be true for me, true for you, true for my family, true for the neighborhood, things like that. This kind of brings in the mimetic capacity for repeatability across a wider range of IQ, and as well as people, and as well as environments, which is very hard to get at exactly. And I think nuance kind of has to be lost in order to get that replicability of shared truths across people. Especially because like the axioms themselves, so like causation, it is an axiom that we kind of work off of, that and there might be limitations to that as a true statement in itself, or a true assumption within itself. Like there's things that kind of skirt outside of that. So or I can bring in like gender, like whether gender is primarily male and primarily female, and then those are kind of like assumptions that we have. And then on the outskirts there are the transsexuals, or gender dysphoria, or people born with multiple genitals, or multiple chromosomes and different things like that that are on the outskirts of our facts about there's two genders, male and female. Okay.
Yeah, I think actually, especially in this topic you just brought up, it's the implicit assumptions that need to be addressed more forcefully or more realistically than the ones that people typically state.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm trying to bring in truth as a more considering truth as a widely applicable heuristic rather than a always something that's always accurate within reality.
You remember when we were sitting around here talking about what truth may or may not be? We were coming up with roughly 4 statements about how to define truth.
Mm-mm.
Truth is that which allows you to act within the world, right? So it's a great way of seeing it. That truth is that which allows you to act.
That's okay. So that's the function of truth, which is different from the Newtonian observation of reality outside of. Well, yeah. Okay, so from the objective perspective, you're looking at things not in how they relate to organisms, but how they exist outside of how an organism feels about a thing, or is related to a thing, or uses a thing. So, like, you can talk about.
Right, so you
can like talk about dirt molecules in themselves, but if you're talking about it in regards to an ant building their little home, you're speaking about the dirt molecule in a different way, or not molecule, but the little clumps that they make.
Well, so I think of it in terms of
that description of truth is in regards to humans' usage of truth, or like how we're using truth, which is outside of the Newtonian perception of observable facts about reality.
I just want to jump in here as well to add another dodgeball to you, Tyler, which is the actionable thing. Is there any truth that isn't actionable? Like that doesn't fulfill that? Well, then you say, okay, well, that would go against that definition. But it seems like every fact, like everything we do, could potentially have some way we can act on it, or something we can utilize, because like
no. That's the process of winnowing it down. In other words, if I make this statement, I am. Oh, this is a good one from a video I just watched. I am an ultra genius, Mr. Musk. Will you hire me on at Tesla? I'm like a level 2 genius. Please, I will save the company. Right. When I put that out into the world, I find out what truth is, right? I cannot act in the world as a level 2 ultra genius to save Tesla, right?
Yeah.
That process of determining what is enactable is the process of determining what truth is.
This is something that David Sloan Wilson brings up in one of his blogs, that statement there is an unrealistic statement, because it's like an impractical truth. It's not a truth that you could act upon. And then he brings in the distinction between practical realism and factual realism. And so factual realism is the description of things. Practical realism is how we utilize those things in action.
Well, even that's what I mean by science being a system of measurements, really, because the measurements are the enactments. And so and this is what I mean by it's probably necessary that you look at the implicit assumptions in a lot of things more frequently, right? So when someone says the world is flat 2,000 years ago, all of the underlying implicit assumptions are something more like, I'm afraid of falling off of things, right? I don't want to die. I'm afraid of the unknown. I have no reason to think that there's anything really round that I'm standing on, right? All of these cloud of of concepts and reasons that lend themselves to the reasoning behind the concept of why the Earth is flat, right?
Mhm.
And
There's
none of those are really addressed.
intuitiveness. Yeah, there's an intuitiveness to the flat Earth model that just, especially in very local communities that don't spread out further
Well,
or anything like
no,
that.
no. What I mean, though, is that if you try to unpack that statement, the world is flat, into all of its implicit assumptions, if you do that in the same way that you unpack the statement, porcupines throw their quills, you find out that what was true, what is of the essence of the thing,
Mhm.
is what we're dealing with here, right?
Avoid porcupines because you'll get hurt.
And the Earth is flat and don't fall off the edge of things, or who knows, right?
Mhm.
But
So
when we
within-
go back and we
Yeah,
say,
go ahead.
oh, the statement, the world is flat, that is a fact that is wrong, we're ignoring all of the underlying stuff that was associated with it, and we're packaging it together and saying, oh, that fact is wrong, right? And we do this all the time across who knows how many knowledge domains.
Well, I guess it's also because that statement has a embedded context with it, right? Like the Earth is flat in as so far as I can see,
Mhm.
but the
Right.
Earth isn't flat within the context of an objective statement, because subjectively it's true for
Okay.
a human. Unless you're on in the International Space Station, then it's subjectively not true because they can
Tangentially,
see
it's
that
true.
it's not.
Okay, so this brings in an interesting point. At the time of, let's say, Aristotle, through the best measurement systems of science, the Earth was flat from there. Or actually, maybe Aristotle, by then they, let's say before then, just in case. Through the best methods of discerning truth, the Earth was flat from those measurements, those
Yeah,
tools that we had.
subjectively and objectively.
So now, 2018, almost 2019, the scientific method is a tool in itself for determining truth. And I'm saying right now, that tool is an insufficient tool because from using that tool, no prescriptive value statements can be derived out of it. And I know from my own experience as a living person that in order to act, I require some sort of value to act. And just even in regards to statement, it's better to be alive than it is to be dead. That is a truth statement that is not derivable from the worldview 1001 of methodological naturalism. That is, I cannot derive an ought from an is. I cannot derive a valuable ideal out of the factual, objective, observable measuring process of science.
I'll push back on that.
Okay.
If you want to keep arguing.
No. Go for it.
Because, okay, so one of the apps I'm wanting to build, which I've talked about on like a blog post called Ideas I Think Can Change the World. One of the ideas is, I still have to come up with a code name. I think I had the code name Niobe, but I can't remember what code name I came up. But it's an Apple Watch app which you measure your energy level, your mood level, your action, and then who you're with, kind of thing. And then after that, then it ties it in with all the other data your phone and your watch is automatically collecting about you, right? But because of those subjective inputs, right, which is something the watch can't get, well, actually, now they're coming up with some really good ways of getting those subjective inputs. So, for instance, like there's building models to read your facial expressions and things like that, or like things to measure your hormones. Like the facial expression reading is really good these days. To figure out what you're actually doing. And like, we've heard casinos have used it for years, but now they're using it for other means, like say psychological help and whatnot, or psychological evaluations. But so for this, right, so the idea of the app is you measure these things because energy and mood correlate quite strongly with emotion. So for instance, high energy, low mood is a negative emotion, like it could be rage or anger. whereas high energy positive emotion can be something like ecstasy or whatnot, euphoria. So there's actually like a good correlation, but then you get what action you're doing. So then with those things, then you can start correlating. So then let's say I feel I say low mood, low energy, right, or whatever. Then the goal of the app is then to start making predictions. So for instance, the app could then say, look, when you're last in this mood, you watch TV, in which case it would be 5 hours or tomorrow, one day, until your mood normalizes again to positive levels. However, if you went for a run, then your mood normalized back to positive levels.
But this is, look, this is, I got to stop you there. Right? This is the left hemisphere's desire to model everything perfectly, and it's totally false. That's the whole point. Because your mother-in-law dies tomorrow, your wife goes into a tailspin, your boss fires you, like all this crazy stuff happens, and your app is sitting there going, you should be really happy today.
No.
Right? Okay. Like, that's the point. Like, the models become completely unwieldy.
Wait. Tyler. Okay, so for that, right, like just based on previous actions, it can make predictions. But then, like,
you're talking about a baseline.
Okay, yeah, sure. Or whatever, or you say like you enter your desire, like, but if it knows about your life circumstances, then it could integrate the knowledge of psychology into the app as well, or it can also give you predictions that way. Right? Like, like a psychologist gets information about you to then, on the prediction that these changes will make these things based on the inputs you tell me. And then they get you to enact those things and they adapt. Like a good model should be adaptive to changing circumstances.
Yeah.
Improve.
How does it adapt?
Well, it adapts with new information that you give it.
Yeah, and that is the key. That's the secret. Okay. And here's a great example of this, though. You say that AI is really good at reading facial expressions now, and you're absolutely right. But let me show you the difference between reduction and metaphorical truth. Okay. Because how much energy, how many watts does it take for that computer to recognize facial expressions? Hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions, depending on what kind of time frame you're looking at, right? Was it 10 years ago? Was it yesterday, right? How many watts does it take for the human brain to recognize facial expression? Right.
Well, it's got the history. Like, there's it can do it quickly for low cost because of a previous millennia of evolution to support that. So the cost.
No. It's the hardware. The hardware itself. Right. I mean, you just kind of hand waved that away there. But what the point is that the hardware itself is set up to function at a much more efficient level, and that efficiency level is the metaphorical level. It's where you're able to lose sight of any number of facts that you need to in order to look at just what is necessary. That's efficiency.
But we see this with improved type of chips. So for instance, like the A12 Bionic chip that Apple has, like specific machine learning chips. Like, so for instance, like the 3 gigahertz barrier in computer chips happened like 10 years ago. They couldn't go over that because the chip started overheating. So instead, what they started doing was, instead of just doing the 0-1 type programming, right, where you write a program and then the CPU executes that program, instead, the CPUs now embed the actual algorithms. So you would have a chip that then can decode H.264 video, which is probably what the stream will be, right? Or it'll probably be OP9. So the CPU start embedding these things to do it way more efficiently. So the A12 Bionic chip in the iPhones, then it's not going through the traditional CPU expensive wattage way to do it. It's doing like a very efficient way of determining, is that face yours? And to do these other type of machine learning type stuff. So it's just like, okay, there's going to be this energy expenditure within us of our heart beating, the metabolism of our cells to keep that alive, the oxygenation of our blood. And then there's also all the nerves that are firing the inputs to our eyes, right? So we could replicate that same thing rather than doing it as dynamic programming. It can actually be an embedded algorithm within a computer that
Okay, you can't just say that, though. That's the hope of all these strong AI proponents. But there is very strong evidence to believe that cognition is not algorithmic. And I think it's tied up directly in this conversation we're having right now, in the exchange between this reductionistic versus holistic mindset. It seems to be the hemispherical conversation that produces the most potent view of the world, rather than just this lopsided effect of one or the other.
Right. Okay. So just to elaborate on what you're saying, because I don't think it necessarily disagrees with what I'm saying, but let me try. So, like, for instance, a computer is only what we've programmed it to support. So when we're embedding a AI algorithm, a machine learning algorithm into the CPU directly, be it facial recognition, then we're only embedding that. But we do have the dynamic programming abilities where it could self-learn on the slow dynamic programming.
Sort of. There's a bit of a sleight of hand that usually goes on here in AI discussions too, because the value of what an emotional statement is also embedded, right? You train the computer by letting it know ahead of time what it's looking for, right? That entrainment
that it already
period,
values.
right? That entrainment period is you gifting it the values that you want it to have.
Well, that's I think Elon Musk, the documentary he was featured in, which was, what was it? What was the one he released at the beginning of the year, where he propagated?
I'm not sure, but I understand. He's saying that's the way to save it, is to embed human values within the framework.
So that's one type of AI approach. So there's like several levels of AI that are possible. So like the train model, like where you have to train the model first, that one's really popular. Like I think it probably came out maybe 10 years ago, whatever, but that one's really popular because it's incredibly efficient. But there is generalized learning ones which don't require any upfront training. But you could embed a goal into it.
No, they absolutely do, man. I mean, you can pull out a specific and we could talk about it, but they all require embedded training. And that either comes in the form of the modern machine learning style, and we could go into that if you want, or writing the code, the initial code, which dictates what the outcome or solution state should be. Right?
So, okay, but this embedded training, if we're arguing about it to be the efficiency of the algorithm, it's very similar then to the history of evolution that humans have. So, for instance, our genes have embedded training of our ancestors, and that allows us to make things very quick today. So it's the same thing with a AI model, which is you train it, which is the evolutionary stage, and then you release it where it's now able to make very quick predictions.
Yeah, so what we're doing there is we're recognizing that efficiency is a value because we have only a finite amount of electricity, and then we're purposely sculpting the programs and the hardware to try to match that value of efficiency.
Yep.
Right, and anytime we change something, look, the only point we're disagreeing on is how valuable the assemblage of facts is. I think that's the only point that you and I usually disagree on, is how valuable this assemblage of facts is, because I think that we overcompensate because of the capacity of technology and science to do these miraculous things like what we're participating in right now. We overvalue the assemblage and measurement of facts, and we devalue the metaphorical assessment of what is common and true across multiple domains of knowledge, and the assemblage of values, which is still quite mysterious, right? Because it's like, why is efficiency even a thing? It's not for a lot of people. How many people are wasteful? Huge, like gigantic beasts. They carry around calories they could never possibly use in 1,000 years, right? It's like, how do our values get assembled? Is efficiency a fundamental value of the cosmos itself? Right? Is entropy an actual law? Like, all of these things get bound up in this question, and I think it's really important for us to recognize the importance of both sides of this story.
Bringing in what you had said about the overestimation of values, that reminded me just of the Nassim Taleb point about the green lumber problem, having a overestimation of facts can get in the way of decision making for sure. But it also it it stands in the way, and it also it's like well, okay, there's this story of the rational donkey that only like runs everything algorithmically, like weighing the costs and benefits to every action that it partakes within, and it's placed between both two bales of hay. Yeah, and it's exactly the same distance between both of those, and because it cannot make a decision between one or the other, the donkey starves to death. And maybe that's probably an exaggeration for our worries on rationality, but because I mean, if the donkey was truly rational, it would make an arbitrary choice in order to eat.
Yeah, well, you're right. It's missing out on the emphasis.
But that arbitrary choice is not. It's something outside of the like the donkey doesn't have. I guess it has reason for it, but I don't know. Maybe I just shot myself in the foot by bringing in that.
No. Look, that's a really deep philosophical conundrum. Okay, and it has to do with like really deep mathematical ideas too, with symmetry breaking, right? What is it that breaks the symmetry of the donkey choosing either left or right? And it may not, I mean, the answer may not be left or right. It may actually be time-based. It may be forward and reverse, right? Because survival is the implicit assumption there. And survival pushes you forward to do something, right?
Do I do what makes me happy now or what will make me happy later?
All right. Okay, so let's run with this examples. Okay, so the first, I think to call out just an obvious oversimplification of it is that with science, right, then it's this external body. Like that donkey doesn't need to know all the facts itself. You can delegate it to this external body that then can make predictions. We do this all the time with politicians. We delegate things to them for them to make decisions on our behalf, or to any authority. But it's a side, like that's a digression. But the point here is that to try and tie it in with Tyler's thing, then it would be, I don't see any contention over there where the donkey delegates, it's the question to this, external being that possesses all science or whatever it is, and the best knowledge of the current understandings of things, and says, which hay should I eat? And then it says, okay, 90% of the time, I guess, it then says, well, you should eat X hay, right? But then 10%, it may be like, I have no idea yet, right? And then you need to make that decision yourself, right? Because then it doesn't have any model to accurately predict it based on the inputs. Right? Or you then have the instance where it gave a prediction, but it was the wrong prediction, and then it can revise again. So I don't understand why there would be contention over this idea that we can delegate to this external authority that then can revise its models over time and then give us better outputs. And at times it may not know, but then we can improve it. It seems like there's this idea that eventually it won't be able to improve anymore. But it seems like I don't understand. That's a huge assumption that doesn't seem to correlate with anything. This idea that eventually we won't be able to improve our models anymore.
Well, you're playing with the parameters of the situation there, but the original thought experiment it's associated with something like, how do we gain knowledge? Is there free will versus determinism? That kind of thing. So Bird and Zass is, you're adding a lot to it when you're talking about whether or not people make choices for it, and 90% versus 10% Bayesian analysis of things. But the idea is, if there are two things that are indistinguishable from each other, right? If you measure them in all the ways you can possibly measure them, how do you choose between two indistinguishable things?
But you have this idea with in programming, I have to make this decision all the time. Based on all the measurements I have, I can't decide between X and X, in which case they're probably equally good, right? So then it's fine. Or you weigh it up and then you do like the opportunity cost and things like that. But if two things are indistinguishable, it doesn't matter which one you pick because they're indistinguishable. But I think that's a digression
okay, so
from
we
the
can
idea
add
that the
so then
models
we can
improve
add that
over
as an
time.
axiom, right? Can we add that as an axiom to our statement of truths? If two things are indistinguishable, it doesn't matter what you pick.
Well, that's what it means is that if they're indistinguishable, it could be from a lack of information, or they really are indistinguishable, right?
All right, our
So
axiom's
then,
getting really unwieldy already.
no,
Yeah,
but there's
I'm
nothing.
thinking
I
of
don't
like
understand the
the
problematic.
quantum models for like explaining quantum physics. That's what I was thinking of. Like,
Yeah.
they both are indistinguishable, and they're both capable, or like the six of them are all capable of predicting what we observe.
Right.
Well, wait, okay, but let's do one that has evolved over time, right? So a farmer says, when should I plant my seed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So before, it was largely like the best models for that were subjective models that were fairly religious, right? And then, sometimes like the answer would be, I have no idea. And other times it'd be, well, there's probably you do this, but then maybe it's like the outcome of actually reaching its conclusion maybe would be 10% accuracy, right? To use the term accuracy for that. And then probably like 90% uncertainty. But then over time, as we improve our models, then we get better and better. We improve the certainty and we reduce the inaccuracy. And I don't understand why we believe that this type of improvement would stop. Like you could then say like the example Tyler raised with the watch app that I was saying, where it's just like, okay, well, maybe there's going to be a geopolitical, a thing that affects the farmer. Maybe there's going to be a political strike. But then that's just another factor of input you weigh into it to make better models, right? Like you then weigh
but
politics into when you should
that
plant
statement at
seed.
the end you just made, it's just another fact. That carries a whole book, a whole millennia worth of conversation, right? Like that's the point. Like you can't just say, well, it's just another fact, because everyone who didn't accept that fact prior is going to murder you. If you come along and say, listen, corn, look, I know we just devised a really good way to grow corn, and now middle America is infested with this stuff. So let's turn it into high fructose corn syrup and stuff it into soda cans, because then we can get more sugar into it, and because we had a surplus of sugar, right? Oh, but all of a sudden this is bad for you. Now the fact is, stop growing corn. Okay, now this is an actual battle taking place.
That's a prescriptive claim.
Well,
Well,
yeah, where did it come from?
well, then it would be like from the model, right? Like maybe it's not economically viable for health interests and things like that, right?
Okay.
But again, like it's just like all we're doing here is just refining and improving models that we were doing already. Like we're just improving accuracy and reducing.
No, that's not all we're doing.
I'm including values within and subjectivity within my models for reality, because those are the only models in which prescriptive claims can be derived out of.
Well, no. Look, so I went with his example that so we got better at growing things, right? So our fact knowledge base increased, and we got better at growing things. And you said, I don't see why we can't just keep going in that direction. This is my response to it, because there's a whole other set of facts and realms of knowledge that suddenly impinges on your exploration of that realm, let's say, right? Your constant iteration and improvement on agriculture and fact assessment and growing corn is now completely invalidated by another set of facts in another realm of knowledge called diet science, or American agricultural lobby, or Cuban hurricane crisis.
But this is what I mean, where we need to build like the interoperability between our models, right? Like the models should be interoperable. The more interoperable they are, then probably the more successful they will be, right? Because then they actually become what's the word? Universal, right? Because if you just
Right.
have something that is only true in this specific domain and it throws exceptions in everything else, it's still useful in that domain. But then in trying to make it predictive for like a more larger, what should I do in the world? Or you need as much information about the world, which is Platonic information, or this universal information.
Yes, yeah,
But you're
yeah,
still
exactly.
but you're still in the process of developing models and
No, no,
refining
you're
models.
right there. That's it. That's the metaphorical creation of new models. That's it. That's it. That's
Yeah.
exactly it.
But the metaphorical creation, again, is scientific knowledge plus intuition plus action, or plus value plus action,
Yeah.
right? So
Okay.
then it's just like you still like the metaphorical stuff. There's assumptions and then there's knowledge, and then it bases those things plus value plus action. So the
Yeah.
more assumptions we reduce to replace it with knowledge.
No, I see it, but it's not like a mutually exclusive. It's not like oil and water, where like, as your knowledge increases, like your past statements are diminishing in their
Yeah.
factlessness, right?
I'm not sure. I think in order to turn an assumption into knowledge, you would have to either, especially the assumptions that we're dealing with here, which are like variable values held through within human subjectivity, or at least perceived within human subjectivity. If you want to be a full-on like Platonist, there, in order to turn that into knowledge in like a scientific fact sort of way, you would either have to become much more loose in your method of science, like by removing falsifiability within
Wait.
your.
But this is where I think, like, where I say that the people who are promoting metaphorical truth don't seem to be scientists, because so much of science, like, not all science depends on falsifiability. So, for instance, like sociology, right? Like, how much of this, like the IQ stuff, like to some extent, it's oh, okay. Well, there was one example. I can't remember what it is. Like, I saw like a good critique. I think maybe it was a Quillette article where it's just like, double-blind trials for pharmaceuticals is something which prevents progress because the measurement of it isn't actually suitable for the outcomes, because it could be that like to the ability of improving. So let's say you measure like this drug on 100 people, you do a double blind to try and prevent the placebo nocebo effects to then measure the actual outcomes, right? But then it's only true to the extent where and then that gets the approval to continue further. Now, it could be those 100 people that you measured on, they have some biological condition that caused, the results to be skewed, right? So it could be like, it's still the best model, but it's just like having that as preventative for actually going things. Like the desire for falsibility actually harms progress there. Because it could be doing a larger rollout of the drug could arrive at a better conclusion than if we just did a small test. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So our capacity to find accuracy gets in the way of our practicality in the usage of what we already know in its limited form. Just like in the green lumber problem. Like if we were to go through the process of actually turning our uncertainty into a strict certainty of knowledge, we would be either harming people, or we would be like we would be stuck forever, because we haven't been able to accurately predict it to 100% or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, efficiency and accuracy are parameters that matter, right? They seem to be kind of fundamentally tied up in some, well, at least in the hardware that we have as human beings, the nature of the universe. And information, which is what our brains are dealing with, goes through various modes of compression right? Photons are compressed into electrical chemical signals all the time, constantly in my eyes right now. And in the process of doing that, it is attempting to convey some element of the outside world along that translation. It's taking some element that is true across that translation. It's a metaphor, okay? The electrochemical signals lined up in just the precise way, let's say, are metaphorically true about the outside world.
Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, my screen went off. I'm not sure exactly when I cut out, though.
Or were you talking?
Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, I guess I have a question for Ben on the predictive notion that by having a model that can accurately predict the outcomes of human actions, that it can give us a value for or a prescriptive ought, like what we ought to do. I guess it would be merely using what was programmed into it to decide as being valuable. So a human smile. So every time I smile, that's an indication that I'm happy in the actions that I'm having. And so from that knowledge, it can gain, it can develop rules or prescriptive commands for how to get that feeling of elation as often as possible. That would be one method of getting an ought from an is, by first presupposing or pre-programming smile, like maximize smile within the human host as often as possible. That would be like a very simple, very, very simple program. And then from that, you can get an ought from an is, right?
Right. Okay.
Mhm.
I'm not sure whether you maybe this. So I just did this up based on what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
So it seems to me, right? So we got metaphorical truth, which is the big circle, and then within it we've got understanding, and then we've got values and actions on the outskirts, right? So and then there's probably our understanding influences our values, influences our actions. So there's probably if we draw like a little arrow, right? So there's can I draw? How do I draw an arrow? Okay, that didn't work. Right. So imagine there's arrows between these things.
What is this space that we're like? I've got a lot of.
Okay. There we go. Oh, there's like a cool little arrow thingy. How cool was that?
That's pretty.
Anyone else see that?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Wait, how do I do it some more?
You have to.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait. Huh? How come it's so? Okay, there we
That's
go.
okay. Okay.
John's just like, give up with the damn arrows. How come it's not on this one? Okay, now
still struggling to grasp this schematic. What are we?
Alright, so anyway. Wait, there we go. We want a double edged one. There we go. Why didn't that work? Okay, anyway, you get the point. Okay, so yes. We have metaphorical truth. It's got values and it's got action in it. But then we've got understanding. So like for me, what I'm saying is, so we have assumption. These are things we haven't tested yet. They're just things we assume to be true. We then use science to then turn assumptions into knowledge, and that improves our understanding. So like assumptions end up being swallowed by knowledge through the process of science. Then we combine it with values and action.
But your usage of science is quite, not vague, but it's encompassing, quite all-encompassing. Like
the process of discovering knowledge is what you're using it as.
I know that's what science is. I guess because Americans view science as a religion doesn't mean that science isn't what it is.
But even okay, so me touching a hot stove and feeling it is painful. Would that be an act of science, let's say.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, that's what I figured.
Would testing for the presence of God be an act of science?
Sure.
Oh man, see this? Yeah,
I don't
would
know
have,
how
you would have big
That's the thing. Like I mean, you go to university, you study science, like in computer science, whatever it is. You do the scientific units. And this is like again, like science, like right here, is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, that last part.
Okay.
Whoa, no, don't skip it.
Wait, no, it
That
is
last
important,
part of the
right?
sentence is extraordinarily important. You can't just ignore everything after knowledge.
Wait, no, but that last bit is also based on these other bits, right? Which again, like if we did this in the axiomatic discussion, right? Which is that when we look into the science definition, right? Because Wikipedia, here we go. Okay, let's go. Where's Oxford? So it's just like these ones, like, you know, knowledge of any kind. Well, that's the archaic one, right? But it's just like science meant knowledge, and then science
is the creation of this dictionary definition an act of science?
But then we get better at measuring it, which is the scientific method, which is then like when modern science developed by actually thinking, we should test things.
Did the people who wrote that dictionary use science when they wrote down the definition of science?
It's hardly an applicable, like a valid question though, because it's
is science making itself? Is science everything? What, like, where does science stop? Where does it start?
But that's like saying, does running make itself? Right? Like running is a process of getting from A to B. Running doesn't make itself. Like science is the process of gaining knowledge.
I run experiments.
Yeah.
I run to the lab. Like, I mean, when you start using words...
How come when I say science, like, by this, it becomes so triggering to Americans? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, how come you always equate people disagreeing with your view of science with being bigoted Americans?
It's really just because we're religious.
It's only American, the American side.
This is every disagreement I have with this conception of science has nothing to do with religion and nothing to do with its opposition to religion and everything to do with its creation as a religion, and for people ignoring that fact. Because science has become a religion.
We both agree on. Like when you can view science as this scientific consensus, right? But then scientific consensus, like when you leave things up to the scientists, then you treat the scientists as the popes, right, or the prophets. In which case, then it does embody religion. But it's so like there's the scientific community, right, which is then like this religion, or scientists, which I guess are the prophets, right? Like there's ways to view it that way, but that's just one way to view it. Like when you view it as the pursuit of knowledge, then it's just like I don't understand what like there's just so much contention over science and religion versus science's finding knowledge. Like it's science's like I don't. Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, it's so there are different layers to this, right? There are different layers to what argument we're having here. Whether or not science is the process of discovering all knowledge, right? And whether or not that has to do with the assemblage of facts or the construction of metaphorical truth.
Or the evaluation of knowledge, I think.
Yeah. I think metaphor is the part of the process of evaluation. So same thing. The assemblage of things is the process of evaluation.
I mean, if we get like knowledge and we get, is my screen sharing?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. But if we get like for knowledge, like fact, information, and skills acquired through experience or education, the theoretical, practical understanding of a subject, some of what is known, information held, true, justified belief, certain understanding as opposed to opinion. Blah, blah. What? How is knowledge sexual intercourse? All right. But But then we have truth, the quality of state of being true, that which is true or in accordance with fact or reality, fact or belief that is accepted as true. So this one is where some of this metaphorical stuff, right? Because this one is a fact or belief accepted. That's just like when it becomes a religion, right? Like, because it's just something that's accepted rather than it actually being true. So it could be a false positive. Whereas if we view it as things that actually map against reality, so it's just like, so we see the definition of knowledge as things that are true and practical, right? Like they're justified. So it's just like, so I think this is like accurate, like where we have understandings, these could be true or false, and then we test these assumptions to turn them into knowledge, whether it was actually true or whether it was actually false.
So is an opinion about quality an element of knowledge then? Because it seemed like within that definition it was drawing a distinction between those two. Like the preference for the color red.
Well, you would be like, you know that that's true. Like,
yeah,
there's no need for an assumption there because you already know that you know that you prefer red. But if you're going to then say,
that's
like,
a statement about the preference. But like, I know that I prefer red, but the preference itself is what I'm referring to.
what do you mean?
Well, just from reading the description there, it brought up how what we know as knowledge is distinct from opinion, such as or like preference. And so, if that is how we're using knowledge, which I think is a perfectly good definition, like I fully understand when I have these distinctions of philosophy categorized properly, I can get a clear understanding of the two and like how the two interact with each other. If opinions and subjective preferences, things like that, are outside the domain of knowledge, then I recognize that and I can use what's outside the domain of knowledge as well as what's inside the domain of knowledge. But even though my preference for red might not be something that I derived from my experience of knowledge, like I didn't, it's not like I came to that preference after a rational argument made to me.
Yeah.
It was something, I don't know, ingrained into me through my
right.
evolution.
So then it's like the question of where does knowledge come through and come from? Like, does knowledge have to come through science? But then it's just like, well,
I'm saying that I'm not sure I would articulate a preference as a element of knowledge, but as an evaluative aspect. It's like a lens for looking at or for holding knowledge in a way. Like having a preference for truth over falsehood, it would be one way that I could use, like seek out knowledge. But if I didn't have such a preference, then I would not even bother in the seeking out of knowledge.
Yeah, for instance, sociopaths are quite content in the belief that lies are far more useful to them than truths, right? And that's a true statement.
So, yeah, I guess just pointing out, by flipping everything that we hold subjectively into a statement about what we know, it really like waters down what we know into a lot of different things, especially things that can be adaptive or variable, such as like the values. Like I might have a preference for red today, but if I were to see my parents killed and them laying in their pool of blood, I might create that event that occurred to me might create a strong aversion against red that is now no longer part of, like, it. My certainty in my preference for red now changed through what occurred to me. And so if it was knowledge that red is the best color from my subjective perception, this is knowledge that isn't very applicable in a long span of things.
Sure. So if we look here, right, like, so we got facts, information, and skills acquired through experience or education. This theoretical or practical understanding of a subject, or two, awareness of familiarity gained by experience of a fact or a situation, right? So your preference about red fulfills like two or here. And like these are subjective bits, right? Like information and skills acquired through experience or education. But and like fact, it will be like, you know, I prefer red. Like you're stating a fact about your subjective experience based on the information and awareness of your experiences, right? So it's like subjectively it's true, it's fine. And you don't really need science for any of that because it's just something you know already. But when we're making statements about the external, the objective, then we need the process of science, I guess, to be able to determine whether or not their assumption, opinion, or belief, and actually transform them into knowledge, fact, or, you know, I've got here like the true. I think that was a what's it called? The Cloud Atlas. They used true.
Let me do another thought experiment.
You mean Atlas Shrugged or Cloud Atlas? I doubt you'd be
Cloud Atlas. Sorry, Cloud Atlas. Yeah, the true in the post-apocalypse.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Are you
Ben? I knock on your door one day. Let's say tomorrow. Okay, I just show up at your front door. My phone falls off and breaks. I knock on your door, and I say, "Hello, I'm from the future, and we did some science and determined that some people need to die today so that the future can survive, and you're one of them. Sorry, but you know, finish up your last affairs, and this is the end. Science. What process do you use to find out if I'm telling you the truth or not?"
Well,
now, all right, look, I know it seems weird, but I think that there is an extraordinarily important principle here, and that is that the subjective acquisition of knowledge is something special from the assemblage of facts. Okay? Like, it's something special and different. Constructing up a worldview, constructing a new perspective is something different than deconstructing the world into an assemblage of facts. And you have to have both, and there is definitely a different type of quality between those two things. And there isn't a way to use the process of one to construct the process of the other. They are two dual processes that seem fundamental to the nature of what it is to be a cognitive being.
Yeah, well, there's what is it? Introspection of ourselves, like of subjectivity, and then there's what's the opposite of introspection? Extrospection. I think that's it. Extrospection.
Or just
like an observation of, yeah.
Like
what's outside yourself.
Yeah, it's like I think it's like extrospection. But apparently
that's just yeah. Well, I mean, it could be, but that we don't need that. Observation is good enough.
Okay, yeah, extrospection. It's not in the Oxford Dictionary, but it's in the Merriam-Webster and all these other ones, right?
Yeah.
So there's introspection and then there's extrospection. So it's just like, you know, like the point where like science becomes something introspective, I guess, well, you know, of the subjective, I should say, is then when it's just saying, okay, for Ben or for John, he likes the color red. Currently, as of right now, right, or for X amount, right? So then that's a true statement about John's subjective experience based on some model of our understanding of John's preference for red. But then if we're, you know, for John to, you know, intuit his own subjectivity through introspection, then it's like fine. But it's just like the point is, where science has really dominated is in this process of stating things that are extrospective. So it's like the ability to then prove things that are external of ourselves. And it's like the scientific method is then like the best tools, you know, the methodology of trying to turn something that, or figure out the truth statement of something extrospective, something external out of ourselves. But like, I don't, so it's just like, okay, so let's say a science, you know, that example happened where it's just like, you know, they do this model of, okay, these people need to die for these things to happen. I mean, these are the same type of things we've done even in times of religions, right? Like, you know, these tribes need to die because of X reason, or, you know, our opposition and whatnot. It's just, you know, with the better models, we get better. Now, it doesn't mean like, you know, you would hope that the model is, you know, from a subjective perspective, you would hope that the model is wrong or insufficient and that you get to live, right? But then we're making those decisions, you know, every day about where our resources go. And these things are done based on our intuitive models as well as our developed models. So that's what I don't mean. Like, I just view.
I just don't think that I don't think any of that indicates that we should wait on the side of science in terms of it just being measurements and assemblage of facts.
Plus, also in.
But I mean, if it feels here as well, right? Which is they do a model. So sorry, let me.
Yeah. Actually, want to bring up.
So it's just like, yeah. So it's they've got the model. They've converted, you know, these assumptions. Maybe some people need to die. They've done, you know, they developed a scientific theory. They developed a new hypothesis. They measured it, and it's like, okay, these people need to die, right? But then the whole thing about, you know, whether or not they should die is based on the construction of the model, which is then in this metaphorical truth. It's adding some values and some action to then develop this understanding, right? Like these are like our, you know, like here, like science models, introspection and extrospection.
Well, no. Like, the model creation itself is not part of the act of science, but yes, you can put introspection and extrospection there. That's where I wanted to bring it up. Like, in Dawkins relating a gene to like a program that's running off of selfishness, that is a model created based upon how he sees a relation between how organisms act and the program through computer programming. That was the boom of the 1970s, and so he's drawing that parallel between those two observable extrospections. But that drawing of a parallel is not derivable merely by observing those two phenomenon. It's an action that he partakes in that's kind of outside the mere act of observance, perhaps. And like,
well, just to get more absurd, okay? I knock on Ben's door. I say, "You got to die. Science says so." Right? Meanwhile, next instant, I feel a tap on my shoulder, and I turn around, and there's an even taller dude who's skinnier with big almond eyes, and he says, "Not so fast. I'm from your future, and I've just determined that the science you did was wrong, and Ben actually needs to live." Right?
Yeah.
And then he turns around and someone's tapping on his shoulder. Okay. Now, if you turn that around, it actually ends up being the antinatalist argument moving forward through time. Right? Like, what's there is something.
But I don't understand what the problem with that, because governments are doing that every single day. And they did that before the modern scientific.
No. Yeah, you're saying that happens, and I'm saying it happens too. But I'm saying, I'd like, make sure you don't forget the fact that I'm talking to you about your death.
Yeah.
You like, forget about all the other science, forget about all the other knowledge domains, forget about all the theories. Okay, Ben is a real person. He's really sitting in front of his computer right now. He's having a real subjective experience. And no stupid alien coming through the front door with his science is going to tell him he needs to die for science.
Mm-hmm. I'd want to know what was the underlying assumption of value that got them to come to that conclusion about what is the necessary action for the best possible outcome. Like, what is their consideration for what the best possible outcome is? Is it people sitting in their holodecks just interacting with the virtual reality? Is that their conception of the ideal future that Ben's death would lead towards? Or is their conception of the ideal future, say, the exploration of the stars, and then in that future, like, say, the second alien, that was their consideration for the ideal future, and that's the one where Ben needs to stay alive. So, like, you can run the models any way you want them, but it depends upon, like, what is this underlying maximum value that you're holding that's allowing you to come to reach this certain conclusion. Because it might be that
the answer to that is that it is the gift of your ancestors. And you can say ancestors in terms of the lineage of your genetic data. You can also say ancestors in terms of the momentum associated with all the moving particles in the universe that leads to the ontological and cosmological arguments for God. But everything you are currently in possession of subjectively is as a gift from the past. And your awareness and your subjective awareness of that is to assemble, as Ben's pointing out here, that the best facts, the best memory and picture of what has gone before you, and use that to keep moving forward into the future, right? To make sure that the game of life keeps getting played. Like these two processes of noticing what happened in the past and building the future are symmetry breaking concepts, right? And they are the measurement act of science and the metaphorical evaluation of religion, essentially. And I don't think that you can derive the one from the other. I'm just not convinced in any way, shape, or form that that's possible.
Well, yeah, so far out of everything you just said, I agree with it because I don't see how it disagrees with anything I've said. For the question about, I don't see how it's how deriving those oughts from the is, like, it's good. I think here, which is like this maybe understanding, we have also maybe science understanding. Maybe we have evolution here, or maybe evolution goes there, right? Which is that, so metaphorical truth. Maybe existence would be here. Because, like, let's take our values, right? Where we decide, okay, Ben's going to be pissed off if, X scientists decide he needs to die while other scientists are fighting. Like, that's then not one that is platonic, right? Because it doesn't have this type of consensus. But we see this, like, where it does have, goes into the realm of sacrifice with, like, say, we see this with suicide bombers. That's like an example where they develop a sense of understanding, and then they enact it. They have the value of whatever, and then they decide to, kill themselves. Or, the Japanese elderly going to defuse the, deal with the radiation after the tsunami at the nuclear reactors. Right. So these are like cases of individual sacrifice. Now, they could also be like, action. It could also be like rebellion here. Would probably be like another one. Right. So then it's just like we do this process, but it's just like this desire of, like, survival is something that is embedded within us, like within life. That's not something that, would fall into what, like, science, I guess, wouldn't value survival. So survival is always going to be outside of the the knowledge domain or the science domain. It can say, you know, X people value survival, but like, you know, the masochists, the suicidal don't value survival.
I just think in place of survival, just put the subjective experience. Right?
Yeah, like preferences of the color red or value judgments, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So like preferences. Yeah. So then,
and
like,
you can certainly make knowledge, like you can have knowledge about what people have preferences for. Like I have a preference for staying alive right now, or I have a preference of experiencing pleasure rather than experiencing pain. That might be another preference that I have, but
I think preferences arise from our values. That's one of the things. That's
sure.
Well, all right, hold on. Look, Ben wants to go to school to study psychology. Can I derive that as a fact, me personally?
Sure.
How? Yeah, it's a statement of truth. But
how do I derive it?
Well, you ask me and I tell you, and then you see whether or not my truth aligns with my actions, right? So, like, how much can you trust me?
Yeah, well, how do I know? Like, even if you enact, maybe you didn't really want to.
Oh, yeah. His subjectivity and his capacity to lie is something that could...
So this is... Yeah, this is the clear distinction between subjective and objective, okay? It's how we, in fact, define the world. So things that can be assembled as facts are the external world, the objective world, things that we all agree upon, let's say, right? Things that cannot be measured, things that cannot be neatly defined as facts, exist as another realm of knowledge, and that is the metaphorical subjective experience.
But you can make the subjective statement, I'm going to university, right? Like I don't understand.
Which is absent of any value judgments about whether you're doing it out of a desire or doing it out of a resentment-filled responsibility towards, I don't know, your family.
Or it's the last job left in Australia, or there's a tax cut, or who knows what, right? Like there could be any.
Well, you could make objective judgments. You could make objective understandings of like the context around that.
You can make probabilistic. You can make probabilistic statements. This is the best we've ever done. It's the best we can get to. This is what we've discovered, that the great grand design of science to predict is probably impossible. Right? You cannot predict with certainty. It's probabilistic. You say, after much observation, it is my probabilistic assessment that Ben will be improved.
Why is this a problem? Like, I don't know why that's a problem.
What do you mean? Why is what a problem?
Like you say, as if, you know, they can't be certain, they can only make probabilities. Like, so what? Like, that's fine.
Well, okay, is a probability a certainty of knowledge? Like, I'm 90% sure that Ben likes or has the desire to go to college. It's not a statement of, I guess it's a statement of fact upon my certainty of something, or I don't even know if you could even consider it like...
It's a very ambiguous statement of any kind. Right? It's hard
which
to say
is then like the transformation of like, you know, intuitive probabilities.
But that's why I brought up in my video the distinction between scientific truth and metaphorical truth. A scientific truth is one in which if it were falsified, it would no longer be a scientific truth. Whereas
it would be true that these inputs produce this negative output, or like these inputs don't produce any significant output. Like that knowledge that it is false is still knowledge, and that's valuable, right? Like, because for instance, like what goes up must come down. That's as much a true statement about that versus as much of a true statement about the falsity of it continuing upwards forever.
Okay, by including things like positive outputs and negative outputs, you're presupposing an objective value to the universe. And within the domain of science, that's kind of a no-go. Or I don't know.
But it's not a no-go. Like his because I mean, it depends, right? Like whether or not it's outside of their ability to where's the truth? Satya, truth. I think this is it.
Jainism, my favorite branch of science.
Whatever. So no, but they summarize it quite well. Where's the bit about it? So like pretty much it is, there's things that I know is true, there's things that I know that are not true, there's things that I don't know that are true, there's things that I don't know that are not true, and there's things that I know, and there's things that I don't know that I know, right? So it's like for that first two statements, right, there's things that I know that are true and there's things that I know that are not true. Like that not true thing is just as still in the realm of knowledge. Like, so when science runs an experiment and it turns out that, you know, they had their hypothesis, this will cause this, but then it didn't cause this, then that adds to the knowledge of the scientific collection, which is that these inputs do not produce this output. And that's just as valuable. Now, you know, then they'll also have, like, you know, if, you know, when you read a scientific paper, they'll say areas for further exploration. So then those are things where, you know, they're saying, I know there's things that I don't know, where they're then saying, go into these areas, right? So, you know, to find out how much of this, you know, what are then the probabilities? So we know now the probability of X not producing Y, but what are the probabilities now of X producing Z? What's all the factors related to that? So then that becomes a new scientific paper for further research.
I mean, I followed what you were saying, but I'm not quite sure how you were tying it in with the prior point.
Well, no, what John said is that knowledge about things being false isn't scientific knowledge, but it is.
No. I said knowledge about things being positive or negative presupposes some sort of objective value to the universe.
Oh, okay. So we mean, okay, if we're doing positive,
I'm saying like me touching my hand to the stove is a negative.
Right. Okay. Because I had this argument with Helen recently, which was that, because I used the word positive and negative, but I think you're using negative in terms of bad, and then you're using positive in good, because negative can mean false as well, right? So then, and I think, yeah. So then we're wanting bad and good.
Yeah.
In which case, I agree. Right? Like science, like its only ability to say, you know, this model produces these outcomes, and then you could say these are bad according to these values, right? Which, so like that's still, you know, still true, but then it's up to you to then interpret that against your own subjective framework to then say, well, is this model good or bad for me? Or
good for my community, or whatever it is that I'm using as my baseline for measurement. Yeah.
Okay, so metaphor is the process of building new truth. Science is the process of reducing to truth. Facts are reduced truth. Metaphor is constructed truth.
Sure. I think that's fine. Why
do we want to get into
constructed truth?
Well,
it's kind of like metaphor as a subjective interpretation. Like it's the subjective interpretation over a body of knowledge, right? Which is then to say, like, for the Santa, like, or whatever, it's like, you know, I can read this study and then I then do my own subjective interpretation of it. Or, you know, if I hear X, like with my understanding, be it things that are assumptive or factual.
So just try to visualize it, right? Like you are a subjective creature. What you're doing is you're pulling in the realm of facts. You're siphoning them in through your body right? And then the process of metaphor is that assemblage of external data into the unique use of that data for your own subjective experience. That's metaphor.
I think the flows kind of work like that, right? Which is we have understanding, then that develops our values, and then we act on our values, and then that furthers our understanding.
Insofar as we value our understanding as, or the furthering of like knowledge within, which I think is generally a primary value that many people hold.
Maybe I should connect this to like this bottom bit instead, right? And then
where on that diagram does feminism sit?
Values.
It's not a science. Are you sure?
Gender
studies. Where's gender studies?
Yeah, so this is interesting. Within having a primary value, say the equality of races, that precludes certain areas for the furthering of knowledge, such as with IQ and differences in population. That is an instance where the limitations from value are limitations of action in producing knowledge. Whereas within the full domain of science as a, not entity, but as a domain for actions or for the development of knowledge, by precluding any sorts of value to the scientific domain, that gives them a greater like playing field for what they can and cannot, or what they can use their scientific knowledge on. So I don't know. I'm kind of, I guess, agnostic on this issue as to whether or not I want scientists to be able to find out anything that they wish. I'm kind of on the feeling that only insofar as a metaphorical truth is proving itself as being unapplicable to a lot of situations, then that's when the domain of science could be useful in figuring out like what are the actual mechanisms behind this. But I don't know. I somewhat side with, or at least I can understand the position of feminism in wanting to restrict the domains of science, because by introducing this perspective as being the monarchical vision of reality, the phrase by Paul Vanderklay, it's essentially meaning the worldview that is above all other worldviews. By producing this through the process of science, it can have detrimental effects to how people behave. And I can definitely kind of feel this way in regards to like how the implicit biases testing that can occur is bringing forth this metaphorical worldview in which every person is acting upon preferential biases towards their own race, which like I fully accept that as a likely reality. But by bringing that metaphor out into the public space for people to use to further their ideological bent, it's creating division and suffering within people of color in how they're interpreting all interactions that they have with people of different races from themselves. That's at least, I don't know, those are just a couple of problems or recognitions I have with the... So, yeah, I don't know what my position is.
Feminism that you mean postmodernism?
No, I was speaking in regards to like feminism as the activist kind of programs. I think postmodernism is just kind of a branch of philosophy, and then perhaps feminism has kind of like grasped onto it just because it helps them in furthering their political agendas.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean that's like for your thing about how they like their reaction against this, where they kind of view like the science as this patriarchal influence, like this controlling power against their lives, and then like that's the because the postmodernism, like the bit that got correct was the bit about these values and these actions, and about like because Nietzsche was, I guess, what, the first postmodernist.
Exactly.
And and what he says is kind of true, which is that when it comes to these values and the actions, we need to understand that these are let me add this here. Intuitions. That was the term Nietzsche used, right?
Or
so
instinct
it's like,
as well.
Yeah, instinct. Yeah, so we have because so I think the yeah
yeah, we get it.
I
You want to go to slide number 23? I think that's another pretty good one that might be helpful. Because it kind of brings up... So this lens I'm using as basically the analogy for any type of worldview. So like you have a primary worldview, and through that you're observing reality, but in order to see reality, you're having to use the tools that you have at your disposal. So like right now I have my eyeballs, which can like interpret light into data within my subjective experience. But besides that, I also have like other elements I'm using for interpreting data, such as my pain receptors. That's another way I can draw evaluative interpretations of my reality that I exist within. And so I guess through the picture, I am drawing to point the problems or that occur from having a metaphorical lens in looking at the world, because certain facts, like imagine those facts all ran along their full row there, but when I'm looking at the facts, my moral lens of central value might leave things out of the picture because they do not conform to my worldview at all. It's say like from the from going back to feminists, just to pick on them some more, they're leaving out any data that would harm their political agenda. So like if it came to be understood that there were differences in IQ and different things like that, that would be something that would be essentially have to be ignored in order to further their political agenda. Or it's not even a political agenda, it's their morally central value of equality for everyone, which is perfectly commendable as a central value. But along with it, there are limitations in what it's capable of interpreting. And of course, if we were to look at everything through the realm of science without having that moral lens kind of inhibiting us, we could be able to see all of the data as it is and then draw our own conclusions as to what the values of this information is. And so I can certainly see how, I don't know, I guess I don't like how the scientists are given a position of supreme authority over what is to be regarded as truth, at least within America. Maybe it's different in Australia for you, but there are these axioms that scientists run off of that is very effective, but they leave off much of the picture in order to come to this accurate model or accurate facts about reality, things like that, or observations of reality, let's say. But I do not like how they attempt to display this model, metaphorical model, because it still presupposes a lot of assumptions that maybe aren't derived from the scientific model, that they're just bringing in through their own ideological worldview. Like, one of them, I think, being something I've noticed with all the different scientists arguing about different models for evolution is a dismissal of free will as a possibility in anything. So, like, all memes have to be self-propagating in order for certain phenomenon to be accurately explained as for why it occurs, and because humans have no free will. I don't know. There's a lot to get into there with that, but
sexual selection, group selection, all of these things are controversial because of choice. It's true.
Yeah, and if you're a group selectionist, then that's going to be, you're going to be at kind of war with the gene selectionist or the lineage selectionist or somebody that it's like the objectivists that I interacted with. They are very skeptical of evolutionary psychology because it brings up these contradictions in their worldview of our behaviors being born about through our rational means or from our conscious abilities to understand reality as it actually is. Different things like that. If somebody that believes in free will doesn't like to be told that everything that they do is born out of evolutionary instincts that they've been implanted into them.
It's I've never understood the whole free will debate because it just seems like people are getting their knickers in a knot over nothing. Because regardless of whether or not people have free will or not, the experience is exactly the same. It's just arguing over something entirely theoretical that doesn't have any practical connotations. Because the experience is still the same regardless of if you have it or not. Or am I just misunderstanding the whole argument?
It does have practical connotations, so it does. That's probably where it ends up eventually. But questions of whether or not people are responsible for their actions come up in legality issues all the time. We do tests to determine people if people are in their right mind, right?
Yep. But that's not I think that, well, that's not an argument about free will. That's an argument about agency. Which is someone could have complete and utter lack of agency, like the mentally retarded, not mentally retarded, so what's the word when like you become a vegetable because of a car accident?
Paraplegic.
No,
or
like
quadriplegic.
like you're on life support, like there's brain dead kind of thing, like that type of mentally retarded.
A vegetable.
Comatose.
Yeah, so comatose, right? So then so like for comatose, so like, you know, the ideas of there's that behavioral psychology lecture where the guy says 3 things that got people out of murder. So like one could be like a tumor, one could be like a divorce, another thing could be something else where they plead temporary insanity. So those aren't reductions of free will, those are reductions of agency, I think. Right? Because free will is this idea.
How are you defining a difference between those two?
Well, agency is the responsibility you have of your actions. Free will is whether or not you, I guess, whether there's whether things are predetermined. Because whether or not things are
then how are you defining responsibility?
Well, what do you mean?
You said
we generally regard responsibility as according to whoever made the act, and like
decided.
like I had the conscious choice to do this action as opposed to this action. And now, because this first action led to bad outcomes, I'm the one that's responsible for that.
Yeah.
Because I was the one that made that choice.
Well, like, so free will, right, is kind of, because regardless of whether or not you have free will or predetermined will, you still have will, and then agency is your execution of that will. And people's ability to execute agency is different. For instance, a child has free will, or a fetus has free will, but they have zero agency. And then
wait, whoa, hold on.
I
Wait
think,
a minute.
how about capacity? I think that's a better description, because agency very much like is connected to free will in my mindset, at least. But I definitely agree with you that somebody that's comatose.
Well, agency is like a legal term, and philosophical. Well, yeah, it's like philosophical, but it's also legal. Like it's legal in terms of agency is how we decide what an adult is. Agency is how we decide, what punishments to inflict on people.
Right. Okay, but you can. Right. So the difference is an agent is the one who. An agent is the one who chooses, right? But if an agent is inside a locked cell, they are not free to move about, right? So that's the difference between.
There's a difference. Like, this is something that seems to be mixed up about the whole free will thing, because the free will thing isn't saying whether or not you have will or not. It's saying whether or not that will is predetermined. But you still, even if it is predetermined, like, you believe in fate and destiny.
What do you mean by will then?
Like, so for instance, the idea against free will is then the idea of fate or destiny. Like, it was pre-decided divinely that you would die on this date, right? Or like, that you would succumb to alcoholism, right? Like, they would say it was his fate or it was his destiny,
genetics
kind of thing, right?
Things like that.
So then it's just like if one concedes fate or destiny, like if they acknowledge those things exist, then it's to say that predetermined events occur, in which case then it says, well, there isn't will in terms of it's free, in terms of the future is undetermined.
But you described a scenario, but what I'm asking is, like, the subjective experience is one of a number of possible futures and then deciding one. And then that's your will. That's how you define will. I willed this single course of action, right?
But I don't know. I just read Sam Harris's book. So Sam Harris's point is that you willed that action, but the reason you willed it was because you thought that this action was better than other actions.
I know.
You had no control over whether or not you had no control over what you already value.
And Sam had no control over writing that horrible piece of philosophy in his book.
I know.
Well, but it's not about control though, like, because this is like the weird thing, which is because there's a clear distinction between agency and will.
It's all about control, man.
Wait, because for instance, there's no amount of arguing about free will, the philosophical question of determinism versus predeterminism, fate and destiny, or I don't guess future chaos, that removes the decision of agency. Like no matter whether our will is predetermined, we still have.
No, wait.
No.
Lots of people are having the argument that if you have no, so for instance, Robert Sapolsky. Okay.
Yeah. If I build a robot that it swings an axe left and right, and that's its agency, that's what it's capable of doing, and it chops somebody in half, who's responsible for that? Who's going to be punished? Is it the robot or is it me, for the one that created the robot?
Yeah. But we're not talking about, like, okay, you would then say the will of the robot is predetermined, but the robot has no agency, right? The robot is like so that's the
robot is predetermined.
I know.
I am holding it, guys.
But there's a difference here, which is if you embedded choice into the robot, then you could like if it has the ability to decide, right? about something, which is it can get X inputs and then weigh up, a different fork in the road of actions. Then that's the idea of agency.
I don't know
right
why
now,
let's not use robots. Let's use ourselves, okay? I don't know why this always ends up happening. People exist. You are people. We are people. Let's use ourselves. You exist. You see multiple different futures in front of you, okay? One of them is you responding to this series of words that I'm using right now, saying, you know what, Tyler, that's the coolest point I've ever heard about free will and determinism. I've changed my mind completely. And the other is not that, right? What's it going to be? You have a selection of these choices and you have to like worm your way through them, let's say, and they're complicated and multifaceted and ambiguous and weird. But you have the sense of doing that, of choosing between several versions of what the future may be.
Yeah. But I mean, like, okay, you put people in a experiment, right? Like a psychological experiment, like the Milgram's experiment or whatever, right? Or the prison experiment. So you can know from the model of the inputs and of their personality profile, whatever else history you have about them. You can make predictions about their behavior. Like, so
probabilistic predictions, yes.
Yeah. Like Darren, is it not Darren?
Darren Brown, yeah.
Darren Brown, right? So that's like those types of exploits, which is given X inputs, I can predict these people. But these people, their subjective experience is still of agency. They still have a choice. Now, if you so regardless of whether or not a situation was it was fixed or not, the people operating within it still operate with choice, be it whether choice is an illusion or not. They still operate with the conception of agency.
So somebody that's hypnotized to shoot Stephen Fry on stage, he's just as responsible for that action as if he did it if he wasn't hypnotized, because he's experiencing a story that he tells himself that I made that choice.
So this is interesting, right? Because if we hypnotize someone, then we kind of reduce their agency, which I guess is why the like if we fix outcomes, especially in like say the prison experiment or whatever it is, which is probably why those things are banned now, which is that it becomes we're by fixing an outcome over an adult's agency, we reduce their agency and we make them more as if they're a child, in which case we inherit the responsibility of their lack of agency. So like, if our child does something bad, then, hopefully the parents, bear that responsibility. But then as the child gains agency, there's less and less agency on the parent. So it's kind of like if we're fixing a situation of adults or of agents, then we bear that responsibility. Like we do the same with army people, right? Like the general, the what was it? Army, the soldiers, they reduce their agency to enforce the general's commands, and then the general inherits the responsibility. That's why, like, we hanged the generals of Nazism. We didn't hang every individual soldier because the soldiers submitted their agency.
What we do is we endeavor to assign responsibility to the locus of choice.
Yep.
So yeah, it seems like you're using agency regularly, and like every time you're using it, I keep on like interpreting it as free will, because it that's the only way it kind of makes sense. In order for there to be a increase or a decrease in agency, there has to be some element of free will or ultimate. I don't know. I don't know if I can say ultimate agency.
You are assigning responsibility at the locus of choice. Now, either you do that subjectively in the individual, or you just keep going backwards in the contiguous chain of momentum. Okay, it wasn't me. It was my genes. It wasn't my genes. It was their daddy. It wasn't their daddy. It was their daddy. And eventually, you either get to A, God, or B, randomness. Those are the only two options. This is what we've discovered, right?
Right.
It's the great big argument.
Well, it's because, I guess, how do you hold people responsible for things outside your control? That's the question. Or who do you hold
outside their control?
Yeah, sorry, outside of my control, right? So for one's control. So who does one hold responsible for things outside of their control? So one's control, right?
Yeah.
So
Well,
then
it's usually God that gets blamed, right?
yeah. But I mean, like, but for instance,
Or if you're
if
a libertarian,
they've
then it's the
sacrificed,
government.
yeah, but if they've sacrificed their agency to a doctor in surgery and that doctor abuses that circumstance, then they sue the doctor, right? So it seems like where there is an individual responsible or an institution, then we punish that institution for bad behavior according to the restriction of agency, which I guess is how much that institution fixed the situation for our reduction. But the question of free will isn't whether a man fixed it, it's whether or not nature fixed it, I guess, right?
This is where Daniel Dennett's argument against Sam Harris actually becomes pretty interesting, because Daniel Dennett kind of accepts the fact that we don't have free will, and he's placing a like responsibility onto Sam Harris and saying that you shouldn't be telling people that they don't have free will, because people that believe that they don't have free will are going to behave psychologically without regard towards their own actions. Like there's different tests like that, like people that have read an essay that talks all about the facts about how humans don't have free will are more likely to cheat on a test after the reading than those that haven't. And so do you place the locus of responsibility on Sam Harris for like exemplifying this meme out there that's propagated, and then him like holding it out for people to listen to, and like they have no control over it because they have no free will, or because Sam Harris doesn't have free will and he's just babbling off of his own pre-programming about just talking about whatever he thinks is true, whether it's beneficial for humanity or not, then it's like the whole idea of responsibility is inaccessible when you lose the meme of free will from the conversation.
Right. But I mean, like in Western civilization, we consider someone adult who is someone who is responsible to the extent that they are responsible, right? Which is to the extent they aren't placed in a situation where their outcomes were fixed, I guess, right? Or like, where their outcomes were within the agency of somebody else instead of themselves. You see this, like, I was actually reading like law about whistleblowing. So like organizations do a lot of dodgy stuff to prevent whistleblowers within organizations. And, and they're held liable in good countries where if you prevent, where if you do like manipulation of employees to prevent truth from manifesting itself within the organization, then that is you become liable because you reduce your employees' agency. Like that's what they kind of do. Like they just work to reduce their employees' agency. Like they even gaslight them and stuff sometimes, like to be like downplay or make things up and whatnot, to reduce the agency of the potential whistleblower. But the inherent part of, I guess, Christianity or Western civilization is this idea of an adult, which is that we are now responsible for our actions. But we always do that line, right? Like a revolution is when we were not happy anymore with the government's prescription of our agency anymore, like of its fixing of a situation. Whereas like we now demand more agency than what was allotted. So I think, but I think the risk that, like, I don't particularly follow Sam Harris's arguments on that, but if Sam Harris is actually arguing in the idea of conflating the two to then say everything's predetermined, therefore it doesn't matter, or whatever it is, then like, that's a call to reduce agency, in which case that's a terrible idea. Like you then convert adults to children. But sometimes, like say for instance, like the case of like workplace rights, these are cases where there is humans to blame for fixing situations, and you have to work on that. Like a lot of, like, it is a fine balance. Like how much is a situation fixed? Do we blame an adult, another person, for our reduced agency? But it seems like the ultimate thing with free will is whether or not nature has fixed it. But then who the hell do we blame? Like if nature has fixed it, then it's
That's
just
what I
like,
said.
well, that's what you assume agency.
You either
That's
blame
when
God or randomness, and nature encapsulates both. It's,
yeah.
You can't
Because
blame
if you,
randomness. That leaves you with God. So
Yeah.
we always got to have somebody to shake our fist at.
well, it's different, right? Because I don't see how God is different from man in that instance. Because otherwise, you would say God's on my side, and you commit an atrocity, right? Whereas, but maybe you mean nature in terms of like, because what it seems then, if nature, because the idea of the West then seems to be where nature, where we refuse to accept nature fixing our outcomes. Whereas the Buddhist is the exact opposite, it seems to me, where the Buddhist is just like, I could just submit to the fixing of nature. Whereas, you know, the West is like, we will not accept nature's inhibition of our agency, where we will implore it and we will act as if nature has no bearing on us. Kind of thing. Or like, you know, we do the balance, obviously. Like, you don't want to go off into a desert without water because but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Do we want to wrap up?
Yeah, okay. One instance for the slide that you mentioned earlier,
Oh, okay, cool.
to give credence to it, let me just pull up that slide again. Which window is it?
Slide 23.
Yeah, I need to find which window I have it open. Oh yeah, this one. All right, so the Lindian. Oh God, how many of your things do I have open? Okay, 23. All right. Okay. Okay. Well, it wasn't really. You said a instance of where people's belief in science, as if science, like if they don't understand that a scientist is operating on metaphorical truth,
Yeah.
right? Rather
And I don't
than
think even
the
scientists
scientific
realize
knowledge.
this either.
Yeah. Whereas that's what can, so you see this, like the insufficiency of this, like to give an example, would be where there needs to be pushback from more unscientific people, would be pharmacy drugs, like therapeutic, psychopharmacals, psycho drugs, just psycho drugs, right? So it'd be like, oh, you feel sad, take some antidepressants, right? Whereas, you know, someone who then could be more, because they're like sad, bad, you know, feeling good, good, here's antidepressants, they turn bad into good, right? Whereas the proper, so then it's like going back into that diagram, where it's like one model of knowledge, where there's some assumptions that are then converted into some facts, which is operating, but then injected with some values and some actions. But it's not one that is platonic or universal, because then there's competing interpretations at that current present, which is then you could then have a, what would you call it? The priest. Who's the person you talk to at church? You confess your sins to?
Yeah, priest.
Yeah, so you have your priest,
or a
right? Or
rabbi,
your rabbi or psychotherapist or your counselor, like the role of a counselor. But then, you know, they could then say, okay, you know, bad is bad, feeling good is good, but then they have a different way of getting there. So then there's competing, what do you call it, strategies or competing actions and competing values, right? So different competing metaphorical truths. And when they're competing, then that, I guess, isn't in this platonic scientific consensus. Like it's not in the scientific consensus phase. It's still in the
because it's uncertain at that point. Like there's competing values at play, and just like there's competing models for quantum mechanics at play. In order to, when there's competing things that both produce the same results, there's no method of choosing one over the other. You're kind of like the Billiman's ass. What was it?
Burdens.
Birds?
Burdens. B-U-R-D-A-N.
Where scientifically you could not pick one over the other. It would have to come under human preference or opinion or arbitrariness between the two. That's when they both lead to the same results. Though if like you're going to your priest to get your values, or like getting prescriptive actions for what you're supposed to be doing, it might be different from what, say, a pharmacist will give you, because the priest might have a larger focus for what they're trying to improve, such as, like, say, the family itself. Whereas if you're going to a doctor, the doctor is trying to improve just you as an individual organism. If you're going to the psychologist, they're trying to improve you as a mental character.
So they have like different perceptions, right? Or different values, and then different training and different actions. So I think that's interesting, right? Because that does play into this idea of, scientists abusing power, which is when something of science, like a scientist, is operating in something that doesn't have, I guess, what we call it, where it's not considered wisdom by the population.
Yeah.
Right.
So
then
I think
it is then problematic.
Yeah.
Because
so
it's negating other forms of truth.
Yeah, Sam Harris bringing up how the death penalty is irrational because humans have, like, if I was born into Son of Sam's body, I would be just as, like, I would be the exact same person, and I would have no responsibility. Or I'm like messing it up, but yeah, because the death penalty is kind of an act of retribution against what we recognize as evil, like somebody consciously intending harm against somebody, and psychological harm or physical harm or anything like that, and then acting upon those impulses
again, right? Like you kill killers so they can't kill again. Same thing.
Yeah, and Sam Harris, like, understands putting away killers, and I suppose, yeah, there is the pragmatic argument for the death penalty, just like if you don't want to expend resources towards hosting them in the prison.
But I just don't understand. Actually, no, I'm not going to go there. But also a discussion.
Hey, you know what you use? You know what you use to help understand something that you don't understand?
What?
A metaphor.
Okay. Here's another example. Like, through science, you can get a clear understanding that a fetus is, like, you can describe scientifically a fetus as a clump of cells that has, and then you can draw assumptions about that clump of cells that is not conscious. Excuse me.
John,
under the assumption
down his trachea.
Yeah, under the assumption that consciousness is emergent at a certain age or something like that. And so has no human rights prior to consciousness emerging and being able to experience pain, something like that. That's your measuring tool for what is a human person. And then anything prior to that does not fall under that measuring tool. And so that's another way in which, like, somebody from a scientific perspective, and then the more average population, or maybe more conservative population, let's say, since it's a wide-ranging topic, will have completely differing measurements for what is a human person. Or it's not even that, it's also in regards to, like, the woman's responsibility and her actions, different things like that. There's a whole host of other value-laden judgments all within this one issue and topic. So yeah, as an American, and especially like a religious American, I am peeved by the more elitist scientists that do not recognize that they are working off of assumptions for reality that not everyone agrees with. And then they are confused when people disagree with the facts, even though they aren't able to articulate why in a way in which will be understood by the scientists, because scientists are working within their own paradigm, and everybody else is kind of working off of their own, and they don't have the capacity to argue against them as best as they can.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's one of the, when I watched those debates, like Hitchens and Sam, they would argue with a Jewish guy who argued on behalf of Christian. Actually, I don't know whether he was Jewish or whether he was Christian. Like, he always wore black suits, very smart looking, kind of looks like...
I think he described himself as a secular a secular Jewish person that like has no dog in the fight in regards to Christianity, but...
Yeah. And he kind of looks like Ted Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
Like a skinny version of Ted Cruz. But he was great, because he kind of, I guess, operated. Do you know his name?
No, I've heard of him.
Let me see if I can...
versus Sam Harris. It was like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. I don't think I've actually seen a full debate.
I watched all of these like back in the day, like 2014, 2015. I watched all of these because I wanted to find out, like, I had been robbed of what I thought was true. Like, my worldview fell down. So then I was like, shit, what is actually true?
Yeah, I think it's David Berlinski. Because, I was
going to say, it's got to be David Berlinski. I can't imagine any other... I don't know of any other Hitchens Harris.
Yeah.
And secular Jew matches that. He's not even really Jewish, but yeah, he's an interesting character. I haven't seen him on...
Not Berlinski. It's another guy. But I'm actually...
Okay.
Let me see if I can find the guy. Harris.
I've been
but anyway, we don't need to...
I think... I don't know. What I'd like to see is people being able to recognize that they're running off of heuristics, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem. Like, if I had a heuristic that I knew to be absolutely certain on, and then I used that for how I lived my life, and then it turns out, oh, that heuristic is only accurate in 99% of situations. That doesn't change much for me. And like, that's a change I'm willing to partake in. And if I can know what circumstances where that heuristic is untrue, then...
See, I think it changes everything. It's because it's in that little kernel of doubt that transforms the person lying in a gutter, like drowning in their own poor intentions and vomit. It transforms that person who can't see anything other than their total failure into a great success story, a towering figure in some industry, because of that one little doubt that they had, which was that they weren't a failure and that they could be something else. Like this little tiny little room for doubt, the way things ought to be, not the way they are, that is all the difference that you need.
Yeah, that's true. Like, I can certainly see for a lot of theists that, like, belief in God is only like 99% true, or even like free will as a heuristic, like that gives me a little bit of leeway in like, this isn't actually me doing it, this is my environment that's making me do this bad thing.
Okay, I found the guy, Rabbi Wolpe. His stuff's really good. His debates with Harris and Hitchens. Because he kind of argues like, oh, where it's just, you know, he argues quite well.
Yeah, well, we're kind of Protestants, so William Lane Craig is probably our guy. But William Lane Craig is really smart as well, and it's very interesting because William Lane Craig is kind of working off of a similar paradigm as, say, Sam Harrison, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins, something like that, where it's distinct from Peterson's kind of pragmatic conception of truth, or even like in regards to metaphorical truth, things like that. It's very much tied within logic and truths that exist, like necessarily, things like that. And I don't know. I'm kind of tied because, like, I like a lot of the Aristotelian logics and truth propositions, and then fitting those together into syllogisms and all that. It's great, but I think there is always a way in which one can adopt a perspective so that the propositions within a syllogism are false, or at least have that kind of like 3% window of probability of not being accurate. Like, yeah.
I'll just share, because it ties in with what Tyler just said. So I did a series of tweets recently that kind of tie into this question. So the first one is, so Aaron Swartz, great documentary about him, internet's own boy. So he killed himself after trying to get all scientific papers released in the public domain, which by copyright, they are public domain material, most of them. But the distribution is controlled, just like similar to diamonds, I guess. So Aaron Swartz thought a free and open internet was this potential unmet, squashed, or squandered. Many liberty-orientated dissenters face this. To what extent is failure to seize opportunity theirs, others, or circumstantial? How much cross should they bear? Then the resurrection of Jesus seems to me to mean, if you endure your cross even unto death, then God will ensure that your sacrifice was not in vain. So this is like a metaphorical truth. This cannot be proven scientifically, right?
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Especially, okay, sorry. Yeah, finish your point.
Yeah, just let me read these two. So, how does one manifest the potential, especially when resources and opportunity around them is so scarce, or even hostile towards them? Do they continue to try blindly and trustingly? Do they reform the circumstances to become more fertile and hospitable? Do they expose the hostility? And what if they meet resistance every step of the way? That their initiative causes too much challenge to the celebrity. What shall they do then? How long should they suffer for? How do they choose when to desist, leave, prepare, invest, reform, or fight? So I think like these things kind of touch onto that bit of like, you have to weigh this up when you're operating in the world, which is how like it's like this bit, which is, to what extent are my failures my responsibility, someone else's responsibility, or just circumstantial? Because where that responsibility lies then determines where your action is, because you need to be able to meet your potential with resources and opportunity to not want to kill yourself, because otherwise it's just disappointing. So then at what extent, like how, like, because if it is, just a lack of exposure, do you just continue to try? Like, when do you like change your trust in people? Like, when do you change your trust in circumstances? When you decide, okay, circumstances aren't working for me, when do I reform those circumstances? People are the responsibility of others. When do I call them out? Right? When do I become hostile and expose the others who are constraining me? So those are really hard questions. And then kind of like the Jesus story kind of is the best way I figured of actually trying to wrestle with that, because, it's kind of like that's the life within the abyss. So then it's just like, well, how the hell do you get out of your abyss? Like, is it your responsibility, others, or is it circumstantial? Which thing do you address and which responsibility do you take? And then how do you bear with that pain while being in the abyss? And then the resurrection, because I just kept trying to figure out, like, why the hell was it necessary for Jesus to be resurrected? He could have just been sent to the sky immediately, right? Or, you know, as soon as he died the first time. Why was the need to resurrect him? So I think it's really that if you endure your cross, so the burden that is placed on you, the problem or the abyss that is thrown on you, even unto death, then God will ensure that your sacrifice was not in vain. So then that way, because otherwise, why not just cave in? Why not just, you know, take the money kind of thing and submit to the powers that be? Or why not just exit the game and give up? Right? Well, it's like you have to live on this like metaphorical truth of, if I continue to fight, then I will be repaid. And that's the only thing that I think the resurrection story is about. Because if, you know, Jesus gave up, then, like, you know, if someone gave up, then it's like, okay, well, you miss out on heaven. But heaven isn't a rewarding experience. Like, heaven doesn't really mean anything to atheists, same as hell. But this idea of resurrection is kind of like the phoenix thing, where it's just like, if you fought, then you may end up being able to, you know, revivify not just yourself, but the society, or, you know, be able to, you may actually be able to solve it. So you see this, like, where, like, a lot of people back in the day, like, now we can see the fruits of our effort very quickly with modern technology. But before, like, you could work like hundreds of years or multiple generations, like building a church, right? And you would never see the payoff. So it's just like, you know, these people, like, you needed some way to justify investing more than your lifetime into something. And I think that's the idea of, you know, well, you will be resurrected. I think that's the payoff, right? At least that's my atheistic interpretation. No.
No, it's a very deep idea that is worthy of a lot of scrutiny and no science.
Yeah.
It can't be tested.
I think your point. What's spectacular, I think, about that story is how Jesus on the cross called out, like, soon before death, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That though he was being betrayed and punished and tortured by these people around him, he did not carry resentment with him, but instead had the capacity to forgive even those enemies of his, those that were acting against him and punishing him for being good, for doing what he knew to be correct. And I don't know, that's the most remarkable thing about, or one of the most remarkable things. I suppose the resurrection might be pretty a little bit more remarkable than that.
But I don't know. It sounds like Christ is espousing determinism on the cross there, right?
Well, not necessarily. It could be that he was holding himself to a metaphorical model of every human being as if they were a son and daughter of God, and each one had a implicit value within them, and he was able to somehow see through the exterior element of the person that was attacking them and be able to love them for the soul within them, the individual within inside there. That I don't know how.
Yeah, probably
how that's
if you
possible,
accept.
though.
Well, if you accept Christ for what he purports to be, then that's probably the case, right? But it's also the case that he's just saying these people have no conception. There's no gravity for what they're doing, right? And that's fairly easy to state if the situation is taken at face value, right? They couldn't possibly understand what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's an easier thing to forgive than considering somebody that is consciously intending to do evil.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of my predicament in regards to free will, because I realize there's great practicality in both conceptions and drawbacks from both conceptions as well, which we kind of went into earlier in both of those. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of strange. I'm not considering it in regards to its truth value, but more in regards to the practicality behind it, and me using this belief in my day-to-day life and how I'm considering people and myself and all of that. I mean, in regards to myself, I definitely experience the capacity to make choices in certain situations. In other situations, it feels very much like I'm being like I have no choice in the matter at all, and like I take one action and then five more.
Is it
follow
no
that.
choice at all, or your willpower is not strong enough?
Yes, that's probably a much better explanation. And so,
see, but there's a vast difference between the allowance for the grading of willpower, right, versus the lack of it totally.
Mm-hmm.
Vast difference.
Yeah, and I don't know. There's some solace I have in determinism. Oh, it's not determinism, but like even if the world is deterministic, there's an element of because we're determined by our environment, and being conscious of that gives me the capacity to adapt my environment to be better suit the world, the person that I wish to become. And so if I know certain psychological traits or different things or things that influence me unconsciously, I can adapt my environment so as to gain those unconscious influences into my actions. And so I don't know, it's kind of weird. Like even in a deterministic universe, there's still a capacity for some element of free will. It's strange to say, I guess.
Well, I think Jesus' statement, right, about they know not what they do, forgive them, they don't know what they do. That's another case of this, right? Which is Jesus had a metaphorical truth, and everyone else had a different one, and they were incompatible, and the other one won out because it was more popular, and it killed Jesus, right? But then through that, right, like because of Jesus' commitment, and that tweet that I did kind of explaining it, which is that, then it wasn't in vain. So, and then it allowed it. So over time, then his truth then started becoming more and more widespread through the spread of Christianity. So it's kind of like a similar process to this, which is then like, the resurrection blew out, many people's. Well, it's not really like, I think the resurrection, like you could interpret that purely as a metaphor, because, well, what does the resurrection actually say? It's to say that what he stood for continued to exist afterwards, which is they didn't kill it with him. And it came back stronger, which is to say that, his spirit lived on while his body perished. And
that's some of the verbiage that's used in the first century church, is that they are of the Spirit of Christ, like the Spirit of Christ, they are the body of Christ, that they live on within him.
I'd say the metaphor of Christ is a fitting place to end on.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's quite interesting because we tied it on to that's a important metaphorical thing. But just to get tack on Tyler's little troll a little bit earlier, I think through that same process of how we've come to accept Christianity over time, then compared to throwing out these bad assumptions, beliefs, perceptions, and whatnot we've had, and replacing it with the knowledge or the facts or this stat, like, our better perceptions of what Christianity offered at the time, then, those things can improve. And then, we're doing it now, like we're refining that method a lot better. So it's just like, that's not to negate the metaphorical truth, but I think we're ultimately going to get better and better at that. But, it also ties in with the point, which is scientists need to also realize they're operating on metaphorical truths, and realize that science is separate from themselves, I guess.
Yeah. I think a piece of advice for all people that are trying to further their ideological worldview in the world is that what is most influential to other people is less about what you say, but more about how you act and how you treat other people. And like, yeah, there's a lot of things that you don't realize you're doing that people are getting bad tastes from, and from that they're also getting bad taste for the ideology that you espouse. So just a good piece of advice for everyone out there. If you're wanting to evangelize your position, be it atheistic or theistic or somewhere in between, that's what I think is the most successful method of mimetic spreading. And like with Joseph Henrich, he's an evolutionist who brings up how that's how cultural adaptations kind of evolve, is when some like figure in authority or hierarchy commits an action, and then the rest in that tribe repeat that action, so just from watching them and different things like that, to the point where like these actions become ingrained within their cultural genetic I don't know, cultural gene, if you want to call it that, the mimetic sphere of action. Oh, and just a little aphorism out there for anybody as well. Do not try to persuade someone who is not psychologically capable of reaching and accepting the conclusion that's desirable, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Like, don't, especially for people grieving.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll tack some Voltaire onto that. It is difficult to free fools from the chains they revere.
Exactly.
So I think just to wrap this up, because I realize as well, this is going to be our last meeting of 2019.
Oh yeah.
Our last public meeting. We're doing, of 2018. I'm already in next year. So we've got the confidential meeting that will happen later today. You're going to get all the details at jordanbpeterson.community. The website will get a big refresh soon, which will be nice. But I thought it'd be nice to just kind of recap what we've done this year. So we start off going through the Bible series. So we kicked off with Bible 6, 7, 8, Crime and Punishment, 9, Meaning 9, Bible 10. We did a general discussion, Bible 11, 12, 13, 14, 2 weeks and 12 rules for life, general discussion. We discussed morality. We had another 5 general discussions. We discussed the Oxford Union. We did pleasure versus contentment. Bible 15, another 12 rules of life. And then the dating is kind of a bit out of whack. So then we did Beyond Good and Evil, Demons, Maps of Meaning, Beyond Good and Evil again, Sam Harris. We did 4 episodes on Sam Harris. Maps of Meaning, some more Code of Conduct. We discussed them, the Tao, or the Way, and Axioms, general discussion, Ordinary Men. Can we protect society from ordinary men? How to read a book, which will be next week, so 2019. Jordan B. Peterson's Patreon alternative, which was last time, and this one, which is What is Metaphorical Truth. So you can get all the details at jordanbpeterson.community. We do weekly discussions every single week, which that was a recap of some of them. The website will be refreshed soon. All the links are in the description below. This meeting was with myself, Ben, Tyler, and John was the one who presented his talk on what is metaphorical truth. You should watch his video below. I've already linked it in the description. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Any farewells for the audience into the 2019?
God bless.
Google, if you're listening,
we're coming for you.
Science isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Amen.
All right, great. All right, hitting stop broadcast now. Thanks so much. See ya, everybody.
See ya.